Welcome. I think we're about to get started for the afternoon session. Today we have three thesis defense that we're going to be participating in. And so what I'd like to do, since we have some new reviewers who are joining us this afternoon, I'd like each one of you to introduce yourselves. So if you don't mind, I'm just going to pass the mic down and have you introduce yourselves to each other, and then we'll get started. So Michael.
Once again, Michael Marshall. Michael Marshall Design is my practice here in DC. I've been involved with the university since, actually just looked at Jordan's picture up there. He was one of my students, so 1994. I couldn't remember exactly when. And I've been back as a key professor here and continue to follow students' work and hire students that have graduated from here. So very honored to be part of this, and I'd like to follow the evolution of the coursework here. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm Roger Schwabacher. I'm a senior principal with HOK and the newly appointed design lead for our East Coast practice.
Congratulations. Hi, I'm Antonio Rebello. I'm a partner at Grimmon Parker Architects and director of design, and also an alum of the School of Architecture here, so glad to be here.
I am Maureen Genovese. I'm an architect with David M. Schwartz Architects in DC, and I am an alum from 2010 here at Maryland.
Hi, I'm Noonie Reddig. I'm also an alum of architecture and real estate development here at Maryland, and I think all the architecture students should study real estate development. I am with Suzanne Reddig Architecture, and we design and develop housing and specialize in infill, and we're based in DC.
I'm Bill Bonster. I'm an 83 BArch grad. I just did the math, and that was 39 years ago, which is kind of frightening me. But I've been involved here in the school ever since, and really happy to be here and participate.
And I want to thank you all for taking time out of your busy schedules to join us today. This is, as you know, a very significant part of architectural education. This is where our distinguished master's students defend their thesis, and your review of their work and comments are an integral part of the final step in their graduation. So I really appreciate your participation. We will now hear from Felicia Jenkins, who doing a very fascinating project, which I think you're going to enjoy finding out about. Her committee chair was Ronit Eisenbach. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Felicia, and she's going to take you on a journey.
Thank you, Professor Conrad. So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for joining in today on this final presentation. Before I get into my presentation, I have a few thank yous that I have to make first. First, I'd like to thank my chair, Professor Ronit Eisenbach, and committee members, Professors Lindsay May and Professor David Cronrath, for your guidance and support throughout this project. Second, I'd like to thank my entire cohort. Also for your support and feedback throughout the semester. More importantly, all the snacks that you left for me throughout the semester. And then lastly, I'd like to thank my family, my friends, and a special shout out to my parents. Thank you guys for your love and support and for never letting me give up. All right. This project is titled More Than a Marker. And first, getting into the project, I'd like to tell you a quick personal story about how I learned of the history of my hometown, Southampton County, Virginia. One day, around sometime around 2007 or 2008, I was 11 or 12, I was riding with my dad through town, and we passed a road sign named Blackhead Signpost Road. And when I saw the sign, immediately I was like, what kind of name is Blackhead Signpost Road? And in that moment, I would begin to learn of the history of Nat Turner's slave rebellion, one of the largest slave rebellions of enslaved people in United States history, a history that happened right where I was growing up. Long story short on the rebellion, the night of August 21st, 1831, Nat Turner and a group of around 75 other enslaved people would go around the county, killing around 55 white men, women, and children due to their place in society at the time as being slaves. Subsequently, an enslaved person was decapitated, and their head was placed on a post at the very site where this road sign was placed as a warning to the enslaved what would happen if they were to rebel again, giving the road its name of Blackhead Signpost Road. After much debate amongst the citizens of the county over a number of years, around February of 2021, the road sign was removed and a marker was put in its place. I would not hear of Nat Turner's slave rebellion formally in school until my junior year of high school, and even then it was a single sentence in a textbook, and we moved on as if we weren't sitting in the middle of Southampton County, Virginia, and just minutes away from the road sign, Blackhead Signpost Road. So since then, the curiosity and question of what happened here would always ring in the back of my head while driving down the roads of my hometown. Fast forward to my second year in grad school, and I'm learning about the past of Richmond, Virginia, in the Black Experience in the American Built Environment course. And that curiosity, again, would spike on the question of what happened here, not only for my hometown, but also the entire Hampton Roads region. And that's when I learned of this next story that I would like to share. All right. So in late April or early May of 1619, 350 Africans, men, women, and children, were kidnapped from the kingdom of Ndongo, which is current-day Luanda, Angola, by the Portuguese. They were shackled by their necks and loaded onto a boat named the San Juan Bautista, one of 36 slave ships that would leave the area in the year of 1619. The slave ship was en route to Veracruz, Mexico. The San Juan Bautista was licensed to carry 200 slaves as cargo. However, being that 350 of the enslaved were aboard, many suffered from overcrowding. Illness spread throughout the ship, and 143 of them died while on the voyage across the Atlantic. In 1626, Spanish friar Alonso de Sandoval published a report of the conditions, stating that in it they are so tightly packed, so nauseated, and so maltreated. They are chained together with rings around their necks and with shackles on their feet. Continuing on the voyage en route to Mexico, they would make a stop in Jamaica to make a trade of what is believed to be 24 of the children aboard. Many slave ships would stop in Jamaica to sell children, as they were more profitable there than they were in Veracruz, Mexico. Once they left Jamaica, again en route to Mexico, they were attacked by 2 English privateers, the White Lion and the Treasurer. In this attack, around 60 of the Africans were brought aboard the privateers. The 123 remaining on the San Juan Bautista would then be transferred to the Santa Ana. The Santa Ana would arrive in Veracruz, Mexico on August 30th, 1619, with 147 enslaved Africans. This number is believed to include the 24 children sold in Jamaica. Now, the White Lion and Treasurer would each have 29 to 30 enslaved Africans aboard their privateers each. The White Lion would arrive at Old Point Comfort also in late August of 1619 with what has been called 20 and odd enslaved Africans, believed to be around 29 or 30 who were sold to the then Virginia Governor, Sir George Yeardley. 3 or 4 days later, the Treasurer would arrive, leaving 2 or 3 of the enslaved Africans, taking the rest to Bermuda. The first landing of Africans at Old Point Comfort would lead to the institution of slavery as we know it today, and would continue for the next 246 years, with thousands of voyages such as this one to occur during that time. Fast forward to the year 1861, 242 years post the first landing of Africans. Confederate troops fired on Fort Sumter in South Carolina's Charleston Harbor, marking the beginning of the Civil War. During the Civil War, the enslaved were used by the Confederate and Union troops to support their own forces. A little over a month following the start of the Civil War, 3 enslaved men escaped to now Fortress Monroe, formerly known as Old Point Comfort, from the nearby Norfolk, Virginia. They arrived without any inclination of what was to come. They made General Benjamin Butler, who was the commander of Union forces at Fort Monroe, aware that under their slave owner, they were building a fortification. When the slave owner came to the fort to bring them back with him, Butler made the decision not to return them. Understanding that the enslaved were being used to aid the Confederacy, and the men had information in regards to what was occurring on the opposing side. Butler felt the decision that he made was right in favor of the Union. In Butler's decision, he made the argument that the enslaved were considered property and did not have to be returned, as they were now considered contraband of war. 4 days after the 3 men arrived, Butler would officially sign the Fort Monroe Doctrine, the decision which would come to be known as the Contraband Decision. In this doctrine, Butler declared that any slave who got to Fortress Monroe or Union lines would be considered contraband of war, and that they did. The word of this decision was spread, and thousands of enslaved would escape to Fortress Monroe, or now what would be called Freedom's Fortress. So many arrived to the fort. The now freed African Americans would have to expand into the community of Phoebus, creating a grand contraband camp. At the very site that the institution of slavery would begin is the same site where the institution of slavery would begin to end. On January 31st of 1865, the 13th Amendment would be passed by Congress. April 9th, the Civil War would come to an end, and on December 6th, the 13th Amendment would be ratified, abolishing slavery in the United States, and yet another journey for African American people would commence. Now, fast forward to today, in the year of 2022, 157 years post the enslaved becoming free, at the site of what is now referred to as just Fort Monroe, lies these 3 markers that tell this story. One to the first landing of Africans, which is located along the boardwalk of Fort Monroe, one to the 3 men in their escape, and one to what become Freedom's Fortress, both located at the foot of one of the bridges that pour into the fort. In response to those 3 markers, I'd argue that they're not enough. This story and all of its components were turning points in American history. This story should be told with more than a marker. We'll never fully know or can even imagine the thoughts and the feelings the people who went through this had, but one could wonder how it felt for them to be kidnapped from their homeland, being brought to this place in which they'd never been, being stripped from their family and culture, or just simply going from being surrounded by these massive baobab trees to the much skinnier oak trees, to have no idea what will lie ahead for the next 200 plus years. So I pose these questions and thinking of what more than market could be. In what ways can architecture communicate stories of great impact that have often been overlooked or condensed? How can it go beyond a marker, bust, or statue, or be used in addition to? How can design evoke emotions and feelings towards those stories? Then in telling those stories through the architecture, how will it be a timeless piece and that is visited for generations to come? In response to these questions, I'd like to propose a memorial to tell the story of the arrival of the first Africans and their flight to freedom by the enslaved 242 years later. The goal in designing a memorial to this history is for it to be a dynamic space for people to really grasp what occurred in the very environment that they stand. To design a memorial where people actively move through the space instead of passively pass it. Not only to design a memorial that people will go to view, but a memorial that people will go to experience. A project that goes past what people can see with their eyes, but also feel in their hearts. So like all architecture projects, we start with precedents that embody what we'd like to accomplish in our project. In selecting precedents, I place them in categories of the type of emotions and feelings I wish to draw in this project, which includes sadness, empathy, anger, shock, and discomfort. Beneath these categories, I will pull out the architectural features used to capture those feelings and emotions throughout the precedents. Of the many memorials and buildings I used as precedents, some of the architectural features included ascending and descending, the use of natural light, being open versus compressed, and the use of haptics. In addition, I believe the use of sound can also be used. And to expand upon using the precedents, I did these light studies within a project, the model making, and some of them are hanging up over there if you want to view. So To dive into the project itself, I want to give a little bit more of a background of Fort Monroe, what it is today, and how it came about. It was first given the name Old Point Comfort by Captain John Smith in 1607, shown on his infamous map of Virginia. In the year 1819, the fort would get built partially by the enslaved. It was built as part of a coastal defense strategy developed by the Army following the War of 1812. During the Civil War, it would become the only federal military installation in the Upper South that would remain a part of the Union. And it deactivated as an Army post in 2011. And in the same year, 2 months after its deactivation, it became a national monument through an executive order signed by President Barack Obama. So as Fort Monroe is a national monument, it has a diversity of history. It has the historic Chamberlain Hotel, which is a current day retirement home, and Continental Park adjacent to it with a historical bandstand. There's the Old Point Comfort Lighthouse, which was completed in 1803. Then there is the fort itself, and what lives inside the fort now, or at least a portion of it, is the Casemate Museum, where you learn mostly about war artillery and many of the historic figures that have been there, such as Jefferson Davis, Abraham Lincoln, Edgar Allan Poe, etc. Outside of the historic aspect of Fort Monroe, according to the Fort Monroe Authority, approximately 160 families live there, either in a house or an apartment. So I want to zoom out to show you exactly where Fort Monroe is in Virginia. It's part of the Hampton Roads region in the southeasternmost part of Virginia. So Richmond, Virginia is a little over an hour northwest of the site. Zooming in a bit more, you can see that Fort Monroe sits at the tip of the Virginia Peninsula at the mouth of the Hampton Roads region. It sits within the city of Hampton, Virginia, which is somewhat the heart of the region, bordered by the cities of Newport News, Poquoson, and then York County to the north, and just across the James River are the cities of Portsmouth and Norfolk. Here we are zooming in a bit more to show the context around Fort Monroe. Surrounding the Fort Monroe is the community of Phoebus, to the northwest, which is where that contraband camp I spoke on earlier was set, and also includes the historically black university, Hampton University, which also has ties to the history of Fort Monroe. Along the area that is known as Fort Monroe's Outlook Beach, and the site that is going to be built upon sits towards the southern end of that beach. Surrounding Fort Monroe are 3 bodies of water: Mill Creek to the north, the James River to the west, which pours into the Chesapeake Bay to the east. Then lastly, at this scale, I want to show the major roadways to get to this site. If coming from the south of Hampton, you take the HRBT or the Hampton Roads Bridge Tunnel. Coming from the north, most will travel along Mercury Boulevard, which connects both Newport News and Hampton, Virginia. And then both these eventually pour into Fort Monroe, which leads to Fenwick Road, the nearest roadway adjacent to the site. Here, I wanted to show a few views of the area. One of the fort itself. 2 is showing the boardwalk along the beach. And the last image, number 3, is of Outlook Beach itself, facing in the direction of Norfolk, Virginia, where you can begin to see a bit of Norfolk Naval Station in the distance. Then last here, in relation to the site, I wanted to zoom in a bit further. Here's a topographic map. So adjacent to the site, adjacent to the site, maybe I can't. You can see that there's a large hill which encapsulated within it is a building which is now sort of just ruins, but believed to be once a part of the fort. And then across the moat, you can see the rest of the fort here. And similarly to this other portion, this hill here, the fort is kind of encapsulated into that hill. On the beach, of course, it slopes down to the water at those 1-foot intervals. And as you enter into the water, the sloping is a lot more gradual. The water is a little above knee level once standing out by the rock jetties. Now to get into the building. When people arrive at Fort Monroe, they'll park in the parking lot that has been moved a tad further north up Fenwick Road. Once out of their car and traveling down the boardwalk, they'll be met with a small building with restrooms and an information desk about the memorial. Opposite that building is a wall with the name of the memorial and some information about what is within it. Prior to walking towards the memorial, people will notice a long wall paired with a grove of oak trees. On these walls will be the names of enslaved people that lived in Virginia, with the intent of giving people of African descent the opportunity to possibly begin to make connections to their family history from generations before. So as people approach the memorial, they'll be met with 30 Corten steel markers representing the 28 to 30 Africans who survived the treacherous journey across the Atlantic Ocean to Virginia. You'll notice they're at the scale of actual people, representing the men, women, and children. People will continue to see these markers throughout the memorial. On the facade of the entry, people will be met with the pattern resembling the traditional Angolan semikaka pattern, a pattern often worn on an everyday basis, but also for different events such as weddings, funerals, etc. Above the entry, people will see these large pillars meant to be a reflection of the large baobab trees found in Angola, the national tree of the country. People will get a closer feel for these pillars once inside. So looking at the memorial in its entirety, the memorial is broken into 3 parts in relationship to the history. The first space that people will enter is of freedom and last moments in Angola. The second is of enslavement, which speaks to the journey from Angola to Virginia, further breaking it down to 3 parts of the gangplank, the slave ship hold, and slavery. And lastly, there is a space of freedom, once again, in the state of Virginia. Here in this longitudinal section, you begin to get a clear view of those 3 parts. You also begin to see how the memorial is comprised of a series of ramps to maneuver people through, either ascending or at one point descending into a space of the project, which I'll talk more about as I go through the perspectives and plan. So once in this first place of freedom in Angola, which is located here on the plan, people will be met with a fairly large and open space that could be used as a space of gathering, but also a space of learning. Again, you will see the Samakaka pattern etched into the concrete walls, as well as get a closer view of the scale of the baobab tree pillars. Engraved into the walls is some of the history of the country of Angola, and as people will begin to approach the ramp into the next space, the history of 1619 will be explained along those fins in the left side of this perspective. This space is not only a space of gathering and learning, but also a space of last, foreshadowing the rest of the story of the Africans in 1619. Instead of having the ramp start at the point where people would exit the space, the ramp starts within the space, mimicking the gangplank to come. While maneuvering up this ramp, on the baobab pillar are handprints, reminding us that people had final moments of seeing and touching loved ones that they never see again. Once out of this initial space of freedom in Angola, people will then travel through the portion of the story where Africans were enslaved. So to begin the journey, they were forced onto a boat, and to get onto that boat, they had to go up a gangplank, which is basically the ramp that goes up into the boat. While in this space, there's only a ramp for people to walk up, while noticing items that had been left behind within the water that flows beneath. In this space, people will transition from a more open space to a more cramped space. As the enslaved were shackled and made to walk in a row one by one, the ramp of this space was made fairly slim, only about 4 feet wide, to only allow 2 people to walk side by side, and also for it to be ADA accessible. As people walk up the ramp, the ramp to ceiling height will change from about 8 feet to 7. And then last in this space, brief moments of light will shine through this space and at different parts of the day across people's faces, as we remember the last moments that Africans had before entering the bows of the boat. So from the gangplank, people will enter into the hold space, where they will now go down into the space. They'll be met with those same Corten steel markers that were once seen at the entry and within the Angolan freedom space, no longer upright, but now laying flat. When walking through, people will notice that there are empty spaces between the markers, and those spaces are representative of the many lives lost while on this voyage. So the cramped feeling felt at the end of the gangplank is meant to be felt throughout this space with the low 7-foot ceiling and tight walkway spaces. In addition to this feeling of discomfort, footsteps will be heard from up above from the people who are further ahead in the memorial to give that feeling of being in the bows of the boat. As people exit the space of the hold, they'll briefly go across a bridge and enter into the space of slavery. At the entry, people will be met with one of those large pillars in diameter, similar to those that would have been met with at the entry. In addition to the large pillar, there will be some that will be significantly smaller in diameter. In this space, it is meant for people to reflect back to the place they first entered, but notice how it is drastically changed. Unlike the large and open Angolan freedom space, this space has ceilings that are just above the height of a typical door opening. The space between each pillar is about 4 feet maximum, not giving the same level of space to move around within it. And as stated before, the pillars are significantly smaller in diameter, no longer have that edge that they once had before. In addition to the size and spacing of the pillars are spaced in a way that you cannot see the opening to the next space of the memorial from the entry of this space. All of these choices were made in thinking about the institution of slavery, the feeling of being in an unfamiliar place and not knowing what will be around the corner. After exiting the space of slavery, people will then begin to maneuver up the last set of ramps, once again to go back into a space of freedom, but now freedom in the state of Virginia. People will go up one ramp that'll be outdoors, and then the next will be back indoors, creating a sort of corridor up into the space, which is much wider and open than any of the previous 3 spaces that they were once in. People will be met with a wall inscripted with the word freedom in the space over and over. They'll notice that the wall is also gradually slanting down, the walls and the barriers of slavery coming down. However, once up the ramp and around the corner, people are met with a void in the space. Within that void inscribed are the words describing the reality of what freedom ended up being. Slave codes would evolve into black codes, racism, hate, segregation, so on and so forth. Then lastly, within the memorial, after people look within the void, on the opposite side is a framed view of loss, 143 Corten steel markers to remember those who didn't make it across the water. The ceilings and walls sloping downward so that when initially walking into the space, people will only have that view down at the water and at those markers. Seating is within this space to give people the opportunity to sit and reflect. As people leave this space, they will then leave back down a ramp adjacent to that of which they came up, with the opportunity to go on the roof of the hole in the slave spaces, giving a view of both the water and the fort, giving an opportunity to reflect and think back on the history of the landing of first Africans, as well as the fight for freedom at the very site that they are located. Thank you all so much for your time, and we can now take some time for questions and comments.
First of all, just taking on this project, and for yourself as a young African-American woman, you know, stories have to be told. We've been living through sort of parallel histories, and now it's time to show that the African-American history is American history. It's part of it. And we now have a number of memorials and different ways of expressing this, not just architecturally, but through film and music and all sorts of mediums. And I like the fact that you took this on as a project and as a thesis, and the sort of emotional sort of content that you're trying to elicit from people is very strong. But I think one of my sort of personal and professional sort of opinions is that sometimes we leave too much to abstraction for something that was like super real. And in particular, the latest memorial that was one of your precedents was for the lynching. I forget, is it properly called Peace and Justice Memorial? And so, you know, history, when you're able to tell your own history, sometimes people try to make it sort of so that it's easier on everybody looking at it, but I think sometimes it just needs to be very real and less abstract. And for instance, that memorial in particular that demonstrates a number of people that were killed by lynching is, to me, too abstract, because they just have those slabs sort of hanging in space, and you're supposed to get it that, oh, that's supposed to be a person. I think it would have been more powerful if it had been super real sculptures of people hanging just like those photographs that you would see from 20s and 30s of lynchings, and then the postcards that were made that people would send around to show that they were at a lynching. And I mean, it's horrendous stuff. And so when I look at this image that you have there, you know, sort of the abstraction of the people that were killed, I would just sort of say that it just should have been, it would be more impactful if you actually had people. And then there's no doubt about what it's about. I have this sort of funny thing about a critique of the movie Amistad. Do you know this movie? Oh, well, you have to see this movie. It's by Steven Spielberg, and it's about a slave ship where the enslaved people rebelled and were able to take over the ship, but they ended up not headed back to the part of Africa where they came from. They ended up, I think, somewhere outside of New Haven or something, and they were captured. But the film starts off, and it's by Steven Spielberg, with the uprising. And to me, the uprising made the people rebelling, and I just have to be point blank, look like they were animals to me. And that comes from who's telling the story. If they then had started that story with what happened to those people, how they were captured. So in that case, it's the editing of the story that would have made a difference. And I think it would have made a difference coming from an African-American or Black director. So I'm sort of applauding you for taking this on, because we have to tell our stories now. We now have this opportunity, and we're at this sort of inflection point where people are having true conversations about America's original sin, as they say. We also have to be realistic, too, that the people that were enslaved in Africa, there were other Africans who captured other groups or tribes and then made whatever trades to the Europeans to then, so there were Africans involved in the slave trade and the what do they call it, the triangle. So I just, you know, what you set up here, I think is really interesting, because you start off not just with enslavement, but, you know, imagery and different things that relate to Angola or to Africa, and when they were free, and then to being captured and enslaved. So projects like this means a lot to me, and the stories need to be told. So so my point in this is that maybe it's a little too abstract, you know, and I can give you examples of some of the spaces that you design, to be quite honest, look like wineries that I've seen, contemporary wineries where, you know, they have the vats and, you know, everything is sort of underground and it's sort of this moody light that comes through, but with more realism about, you know, what it was about. I'm just saying, just push to really, really go for it. So that's my take on it. But otherwise, it's fantastic subject matter to take on, and interesting site, and the way you set it up with the history to try to tell the entire story from 1619 up into the Civil War, and then Reconstruction up until now is a whole nother story that someone can tell. So congrats on this.
Thank you so much for your comment.
Thank you, and thank you for this amazing project. I like to say the opposite and make the argument for the abstract. I'm no secret to intergenerational trauma. I come from a Holocaust survivor family, and I don't think that there's anything that anyone can do in a representational way to represent the reality of what happened. I think that museums are there for photographs and documentation and quote unquote proof, but memorials are there so that we don't forget, and that we tell the story, and that we can make sense of the black hole in our family life and affect other people who don't know this story or are in denial of the story, or are scared of it. And I think that the role of a memorial is for somebody to experience it, and maybe for it to be a gateway and a place to start asking questions. And then if someone is interested, they can find out more. But I love the way that you used metaphor and fragmented the different sections of the memorial. And it's actually a very hopeful, positive memorial in the sense that it starts out with brightness and it ends with a different form of hope. And the darkness in between, there's nothing that can represent the reality. But I do like the way that you've made it a procession from openness, contraction, expansion. And I like the way that you told the story and wish to visit a memorial like this. My only critique, which is not really a critique, but I was curious, like, when I think of like Angola, I immediately think of very bright colors. And so I'm just curious to know like what your thought process was in terms of like keeping a similar color scheme or material palette as opposed to something else. But it's your project, so, but thank you.
So thank you for your comment. In regards to the color palette and keeping with the same kind of color throughout the project, my initial thought in the space of Angola was that it's the final moment in Angola. You know, you're leaving this place and to never see it again. So I didn't want to be like super bright and colorful, like, oh, you know, freedom, we're here. But thinking of that as the last moment that you see your loved one, that you see your family, all the items that you know, and that being the last moment is kind of why I kind of wanted to keep it, you know, kind of muted in a way. So that was the idea behind that.
So, wow, congratulations. I think you did a fantastic job with this project. Using space to evoke emotion, using the darkness and the light, using compression, it's just the symbolism and the kinds of spaces you created. This is the height of what we do as architects. So really, congratulations on that. There's so much to comment on, so I'll just focus on one thing. So when I've worked on museums or memorials, a thing you need to focus on is the transition from your normal life into this experience, because it's a very heavy subject matter, and people will be coming from the parking lot, like your initial diagrams, and then you have a wall, and then you take a right turn. I wonder if you thought about, you have these pylons in the beach, but you still have wide views out into the open, and to get people in the right mindset to enter that kind of maybe a transitioning from light to darkness. It seems very stark. You go from this very bright space immediately to the dark space, and then you have an open bridge between the two, like how you can transition the light kind of slowly getting darker, or people's vision kind of adjusting to the dark light, ways of mentally changing from your normal life into this experience. How did you think about that at the beginning, and how did you think about that at the end? Moments of reflection, you have this beautiful space at the end, but then how you come away from that, with messages or the next steps after it.
Yeah, so in regards to leaving this space at the end, I kind of was putting quite a bit on myself at the beginning of the semester to continue the story, like what happened, after slavery. And I was kind of thinking of what that transition can be, like you said, out of this space. But unfortunately, that would be like a a next iteration, kind of the ending. But I will say, after you leave this space, it's an opportunity to go on top of the memorial. You can see up here. And that's kind of what I was talking about, like the footsteps you'll hear in the hold. But yeah, definitely another iteration of this project that would come into play.
Felicia, congratulations. It's really interesting project. And, it's an interesting example of what sometimes happens in thesis, which is we take on something that helps us understand more about ourselves or understand more about our past or understand more about things that are important to us. And architecture has the capacity to do that. And what's really interesting is this sort of dialectic between something that is very personal and of you and clearly is important to you, but you're representing people you don't know, that nobody knew and didn't know, And I think the questions about abstraction are sort of interesting in that regard, in that it seems to me okay to adapt an abstract language because of the fact that we know so little about who these people really were. And I'm wondering if maybe one of the things that was interesting about the memorial at UVA that was just opened, the one to the enslaved people who built the university, is you go around and you read the names of the people there, and some are just like, it's like Ed who worked here. That's all they knew about him, which is sort of an incredibly sad thing when you think about to memorialize a life that way. And in a sense, what's a little bit odd about the piers is that they kind of all are almost at the same height there. And I think if they were actually more varied and maybe in groupings, like you could almost see some as a family and some taller and some might represent children and things, and some might emerge at low tide and things. It might, in fact, give more of a sense of how that abstraction represents real groupings, real groupings of people. The other thing I was going to say about all this too is two more comments. One is, in a project like this, you would work very closely, it seems to me, with the exhibition designer to make sure that the narrative of the content of the museum is copacetic with the language and the sort of things you're trying to develop. So that would be one thing you'd be trying to do. The only place I get a little bit troubled is the relationship of the building to the shoreline there, and the fact that you placed it, in my view, kind of in an awkward place on that curve. Maybe you said it, but could you just talk a little bit more about why it sits there and because the building has such a clearly layered kind of experience, it does make me wonder whether there could have been a strategy where the building might have had also a kind of sense of engaging the landscape as a series of layers. So it's clear that when you move into this landscape of the building, you're engaged with the sea, which is where these people were coming from and their first impression of the new world. So a little bit about why the sort of stick sits on the sea.
The sticks, like the markers.
The building sits on the sea of the world. You understand what I'm saying?
Not quite.
The way, okay, sorry. The way this, which is very, not organic and very clearly of the human hand, sits on that.
Oh,
Specifics of how
right. So I set the memorial on this space particularly so that the water would flow beneath this area where the gangplank is. So the water would just flow through, and those items in the memorial could kind of be seen being not literally washed away, but that's kind of what's happening. People wouldn't see those items again forever. So that was kind of the ideal on that. There was a thought of like turning the memorial at one point, but kind of got away from that. So
where would you see that? Where's the place you would have that experience of being on the gangplank? Not so sure.
right here. So the gangplank is here. And in this perspective, right here. The water would flow beneath. Right. Yeah.
Yeah, it seems like it would barely do. You know, I mean, if that was really the intent, I wonder if maybe there might have been, even if you push it further out, the water or something, it would allow everything to catch.
Yeah.
Thank you. One thing that really impressed me about your thesis is that you were memorializing an event, something that happened. And I was really intrigued about how you got inspired by the signage and when you were not satisfied that the signage was enough to tell the story. And through architecture, you actually are able to convey the emotions that happened in that event. I was also thinking what Matt was saying about the positioning of the building, but I have to say that I actually think it's incredibly appropriate. I like the way that you come in on solid ground, and according to your story, to the metaphor, it is Africa. And then as you proceed through this gangplank, you're actually on a perilous place. There's water everywhere around you, and there is this discomfort that you're not seeing the horizon. You're actually blocked. You don't see anything, and that emotion of discomfort and uneasiness, I think it's pretty powerful, and it conveys in your renderings. And as you proceed through this journey, through the hold of the boat, and I think you were pretty eloquent in how you actually crafted all of these things, culminating on something that makes one think about the ending of all of it. You're now on water, the last step. You're still on water, as if like being in the new world, you're still surrounded by water. You're no longer grounded. You're somewhere else. And looking across the water to the horizon and seeing the idea of the people there. I think it is an extremely powerful thesis, and I must say that I was looking at the architectonic of your thesis, things that the way things are actually designed and how things are going together and all that, but the story is so powerful that it transcends that kind of criticism at this point. So I just want to say thank you for an awesome presentation.
Thank you.
I want to comment on something that Matt brought up, the anonymity. So I think that with this history, that everyone in their family that has something like this doesn't know who their family members are. They're anonymous. So it becomes that everybody's story becomes your personal story. And so I think that comes across here. And because of that, the anonymity becomes very personal. And so I do think that the way that you put the people at the end, and they're all the same height in the water, it does make sense, because I think that you can't separate them separately like families, or try and make it like that some were younger, some were old, because they were all equal in the way that they were dehumanized. And so I think that also is expressed in the right way. Something that I was looking at, the way that at the end they're put in the water, and the water is the unknown, so it's kind of like to be determined what will be. Did you think about the connection to, I don't know what it's called, is that a jetty? Yeah, because like if it is like connected in a way, it's like, are they building up the jetty, or is it like a deconstruction? That's another just thought.
So yeah, I didn't think about how the markers could interact with the jetty, but I do think that's a very interesting concept idea. Thank you. Oh, I don't know where to go.
I want to thank you for doing this, and I think it's a wonderful project as well. Your drawings are powerful, and I do see the sense of light as one goes through this, and the light changes from Angola through this. I wonder if there's also a way that there can be more evocative of other senses. Like there's obviously a lot of fear and unknown what's happening, and so and maybe there's a place where it's just dark, and you have to go through this dark area, which is frightening. And then there's other places where maybe things are moving a little bit. You get the feel of being. So there's other senses that are affected, and I mean these. It could be an overload of sensory. When you get out of this, you're exhausted, and I think there's a lot of potential for some additional thought in that regard. I also wonder if you do this with you alone, or do you do this with your family? I guess you can decide. I don't know if you do it with people maybe that you don't know. So I'm seeing all these folks who probably don't know each other walking through, and so maybe there's some solace there that you can view it in your own way, whether with your family or friends or by yourself, but maybe not with other people who might not be interested as much as you are. So I question a little bit of that, but great job.
Thank you. I'll go to Julie.
Thanks. Beautiful project. I'm really curious about the decisions you made during the design of that experience that people go through. So particularly the middle part, like the size of, say, the slavery room, because I was thinking like how powerful it would be if it was like 2 or 3 times the length of that. So I was wondering about sort of what you went through in terms of deciding sizes of and the lengths of these experiences.
Yeah, thank you for that question. And that's something that I kind of went back and forth about this entire semester, like how long each of the sections should be. So this whole thing is about 250 feet long. So you have to go all the way down, all the way back. And there aren't restrooms anywhere in between this space. It's in a small building outside of this space. So it was something I kind of went back and forth for. If there were bathrooms like somewhere in here, I 100% would make the slavery space way longer than it is, because the institution of slavery was over a long period of time. So in regards to, I guess, like the size of the space, the width of the space, I just wanted it to be cramped, to be very uncomfortable throughout this whole entire middle part. So that was kind of the thought process behind that.
Yeah, I'll just echo that the thoughts about the whole procession through the space from the beginning to the end it's very well thought out. And I can see why you ended it with the space that you did, looking out on the water. I'm wondering a little bit about the return journey back to the beginning. I can see like you can occupy the upper level and that does a lot for the experience below. But I'm wondering if you thought about what opportunities there were along that return path for, I don't know if it's additional information, if you're curious about what you experienced throughout the rest of the path, or just how that path interacts with the rest of the memorial experience.
Yeah, so walking back down this ramp, it mimics the ramp that's inside the memorial. wanted to include more information on, kind of like these outside walls. Didn't quite get to that. But towards the end, I did want to talk about these like little fins of these walls. The idea behind that was to kind of give people, and you can kind of see here, as people would walk back down, they would kind of get like a peek back into the freedom space of Angola, and just kind of have in the back of their minds, like just reflecting on the whole journey. So in the next iteration, we'll get there.
All right. So similarly to Maya Lin, when she won the Vietnam Memorial competition, it was a jury had to go back to look at the drawings and figure out the essence and the beauty and the genius of those drawings, because her drawings weren't up to par. I'm looking at your drawings, and there's one thing fundamental that I'm looking at that I think for you and for everybody in this room that's going to be representing architecture intent with two-dimensional drawings. There is something about this section that I think is unfortunate, and is unfortunate because it's so powerful. I wish this section was not cut right through to the ramp. To me, I would have indicated, I would have made this space solid in this being projected. And then this solid in this space here, or I don't know, I think this is the one here, you would cut the section here. In this way, you would actually understand that you're walking on a plank. And graphically, that would be represented. So to me, it's just a comment on a way that architecture can actually help you reinforce your thoughts in how you're representing it. It has nothing to do with your concept, which is amazing. So, thanks.
Thank you.
Okay. Okay, good. Well, once again, I have to agree to disagree. How can I put this? No. About abstraction versus something that would literally tell the story. I think the horrors and effects of enslavement is still having repercussions today. Noonie, I think, for instance, I've been to the Holocaust Memorial in Berlin, and I've seen kids running through playing there because it is so abstract. It just looks like a bunch of cubes. What does it mean? So nothing against what you've done in the sequence, but I'm saying the next layer of involvement with the iconography of what this is all about could have been pushed further. I also think that perspective and the reason for diversity and having situations like this where we can all sort of talk about our perspective on things. And I'm just going to put it into, because I've taught here before, if I had been your professor for this, this is all good, but it could go even further. And the effects of enslavement, again, I have to say, it still is, it is affecting where we are now. It affects you, it affects me, and other minorities and black students in here. And I guess it's a little emotional for me because this ends up still being a little too nice and a little too palatable to understand what enslavement was. It's an easy way out. And it's great what you've done, don't get me wrong, but sometimes you just gotta call it the way it is and show what the horrors were for that. I think of, again, the difference between seeing the Amistad film and then seeing Schindler's List, the same director, but I think different. He depicted each one of those in a different way. And it comes back to who's telling the story. And sure, absolutely. It could, I find, seeing some of the documentaries about when the American soldiers went to Dachau, went to those camps and seeing the people.
show people what slavery was like is to take them today to a country where slavery still exists.
Sure, but she can't, this is Virginia, so she can't do that. No, but that's, in my opinion, we gotta face it. We can't make it nice. It's not Santa Claus, it's not all of that. It's real. You know, if Reconstruction had really worked after the Civil War, we would be in a different situation now in America, totally different. I think of things like, what if Lincoln had survived? Okay, that's my point. That's my point. Instead of the abstraction of these little things in the water or, you know, these sort of hanging slabs that's got somebody's name on it, let it be a hanging body to see what that was like. People sold postcards with that. No, but it could be better than just a slab and you guys are trying to guess, is this a family? Is this a short person? Is this a fat person? Is it, you know, so you're guessing at it. Make it real. You know, the Renaissance carved people, it wasn't abstract. They look like who they look like. You know, you see films with, that also sort of ticks me off, with Liz Taylor as Cleopatra. Well, when you go and you start to pull off the layers, you'll see that the Egyptians were dark people. They weren't Liz Taylor. And that's a discussion, sorry. Oh no, absolutely. And that's what I'm saying. And that's what having people like me here, the diversity, and this is great that the university is doing that. And people like you, everybody with these perspectives. So I'm just pointing out that for someone who is the result of enslavement, it just needs to be more forceful. No, I'm not talking about that. That's a whole different thing. Sure.
Well, it's an interesting question, what architecture can do and should do, right? Because the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, everybody loves the level of abstraction with Maya Lin's, not everybody, but most people did. But they went and put a very realistic statue there to represent some realistic things. And a lot of people felt that that compromised the sense of poetry and the sense of sadness and tragedy of the people who lost their lives in Vietnam. I guess my question is, where do we stop and where do we draw the line? Doesn't some of what you're saying depend upon what the exhibition designer would do, what the contents of this would be on the inside? Is this the only place we address the problem of slavery? It's not. You know, it is one part of a kind of world that we have to embrace and understand and experience the very real things you're talking about, like see these postcards of lynchings that people sent out and things like that. But what, I guess the question that I think Nooney's getting at, that is a question for me, and hearing you talk about this, is what is the role of architecture of this, and how, is it because it's not literal, does that invalidate the proposition?
Michelle wants to jump.
I'm handing Michelle.
Just a really quick question. I'm glad to hear this discussion. But the example that keeps coming to mind for me is the Holocaust Museum in DC, where the architecture is abstract and yet haptic in certain parts. But the exhibit design, as you're saying, in the Holocaust Museum is incredibly intense and tells a story. And so I think there's ways to get both.
Both the Holocaust Museum Memorial and the African American Museum Memorial ought to be looked at together, because the African American Museum Memorial allows one to go underground through the sequence, see the horrors, come through a redemptive space, and then see the joys. The Holocaust Museum Memorial ends in a contemplative space that offers no solace. It is a space that's empty and a void. And I think there's a big difference. But the Holocaust Museum and Memorial has artifacts within it, actual artifacts that are evidence. Brittany, no? We're trying to get it over here.
Thank you, and congratulations, Felicia. being able to see you present more than once on your committee has been really special. And also seeing you present since you were in your first semester as a design student 3.5 years ago, and now being able to participate in your committee has been also kind of a bigger journey. And so congratulations again. And I think there's many ways to define success in a thesis. And one of the important components of a thesis is the artifact or the proposition you make. And I think another is teaching people or asking questions that we're able to have conversations and disagree and talk about ideas and learn. And I think you've certainly demonstrated and taught us all about this place, about the site, and how it could be approached. So thank you for including all of us in the thesis.
Okay. What a great conversation, and what an important conversation. Felicia, I want to thank you for bringing the conversation to the community here. And Michael, I really appreciate both the heartfelt and importance of this and the argument, right? It's really important. And I first met Felicia, and I think this is actually relevant, and Lala, when we were installing the Holodomor exhibit. And she was one of the students who worked on that. And for those people who didn't know it, that was an exhibit where one of our alums had designed a memorial for the Ukraine famine, right? Man-made famine. Within that specific story of telling that memorial and how it came to be, we had 3 booths with asked bigger questions. Whose truth? Why now? And why here? How do we tell that story? And in those booths, it had lots of examples asking those questions, right? And because the context of any memorial is that larger context of our culture and the question of who's getting to tell the story and how. I think I also really appreciate, Michael, the comment of it's time now to see, that there were 2 parallel histories, and we've had American history and this other history. And then, Felicia, I think this is to your point. What was that sign doing there, and how the hell did it last till 2021, right? And that this is the moment to start bringing the African-American story into the larger American story. I also think that we stand on other people's shoulders. I wouldn't be here as a female architect if it wasn't for the men before me who opened up that space. And they might not have been able to tell my story, but they created that opportunity. They may have not told it well. So, or as well as I think I might have, but probably, maybe not. So, Felicia, just to wrap up here, 2 things. One, creating something where we have this conversation, that is a thesis. And we talk about what the goal is here is to design a conversation through our work. And you've done that. It's been a joy to work on with you. There was a lot you had to learn, and you learned it. And you came every single time open to feedback, responding, and laser beam focused on this is what I'm going to do, and this is an important story to tell. And I'll just leave everybody with one thought is Felicia also started this story thinking, I want children around me to see the landscape and ask the question, what happened here, and be able to find answers to that. So Felicia, thank you for this journey. Thank you everyone for participating, and thank my fellow committee members, David and Lindsay. Congratulations.
We're going to shift to these boards now, please. So as we get our chairs organized, I think we're about to enter into another thesis project that will also have a rich discussion. As we confront another contemporary issue, which has to do with post-colonialism and where artifacts reside and in what environment they should reside within. So I'm happy to introduce Adeola Khadiju, who is going to talk about a museum that she designed in her home country. And I'm going to also thank Michelle Lambrakis, who was her committee chair. So, Leila.
Hello, everyone. My name is Adeola Khadiju, and this thesis exploration is primarily focusing in on reconceptualizing a post-colonial museum reconceptualizing a post-colonial museum for West Africa, looking particularly through the lens of redefining what a post-colonial museum is. Oh no. Sorry, give me 1 second.
Felicia, are you out there? Could you ask her to come in? I think she has to get out of her presentation so we can. Or Kenny, can you help us? He's going to take care of it. Just relax. I think we have it. Kenny's got it. Yes. Sorry. We'll be okay.
This is mine. This is still Talicia's. I wasn't leaving.
Sorry for the interruption.
All right, let's try that again. Hello, everyone. My name is Adeola Khadiju, and my thesis exploration primarily is focusing on reconceptualizing what a post-colonial museum approach would be, particularly looking through the lens of the West African gestalt and celebrating the West African cultural identity through that. Starting from the transatlantic slave trade and looking at the decades of colonial violence that stemmed from that, we can start by looking at the scramble for Africa, and particularly the decades of colonial violence, colonial extractive violence that is characterized through the taking of these artifacts and taking of peoples, as you saw in Talicia's presentation, taking of peoples and artifacts and really emblematic pieces of cultural identity as characterized by the 1897 Benin expedition where the Benin bronzes were stolen. Looking through the thesis objectives for this exploration, we're looking at how do we celebrate the West African cultural identity? And how do we really reconceptualize the museum as a way of doing that? Scaling down from the region of West Africa into Nigeria and then further down into Lagos, we're looking at what is that cultural identity of West Africa, and how can this thesis exploration be really characterized at that wide of a scale? Looking at Lagos as a site, particularly stemmed from the level of growth and the level of the best place where this site could possibly be. This site approach is one that is not specific to Nigeria, but is one that needs a large site, needs the level of development that Lagos has to really stand out as part of that cultural center and that cultural identity. So in this image to your right on the screen, you're seeing that level of growth through time from about the 1800s till about the 2000s, where Lagos grew out of that civic center that the site approach stems from. So moving into the risks and the opportunities of Lagos, with the level of development growing from the image that you saw previously, the level of development of land really has come with its casualties and risks, with Lagos, even before the immense growth, had already been sitting slightly above sea level rise, whereas now it is now overpopulated or overdeveloped, so that the sea level rise has become a real flooding problem for Lagos, where it primarily sits at sea level and in some areas directly below sea level. So as we zoom into the site, you're looking at the sea level rise, particularly of that site, but also the conditions of the wetland in the site, where it was heavily developed and the land pretty much sank, so that it became this really crowded, really densely polluted area. Part of the opportunities of the site sitting in that cultural center of Lagos are the major thoroughfares that intersect it, particularly the Echo Bridge, which you're seeing in this image right here, and also the developing railway in Lagos, the Blue Line, the Edo Blue Line, that intersects where the National Theater currently is. As part of that site context, describing this point as a major cultural center, the site context is currently characterized by the National Theater. And the National Theater in Lagos is really a predominant site and a predominant destination for West Africa. And hopefully, as it becomes larger and as this site develops, becomes more global, so that the cultural center continues to develop and continues to have a larger site access. The National Theater is one that is entirely emblematic of this museum approach, in that the National Theater was born out of the 1856 Festec Festival, where they made the National Theater was born out of the 1856 Festec Festival, where the Queen Idia Mas was being asked to be repatriated, but unfortunately was not successful. Moving into the site approach scale, the scale of the National Theater versus the scale of the Gele Museum really becomes one of a dichotomy of what the National Theater is, which was modeled after this really formulaic approach that I'm taking to the Gele Museum, but modeled after the helmet, versus the Gele Museum modeled after the Gele, which is basically a head wrap that becomes really, the Gele is a head wrap that you're seeing as it follows us through the presentation on the bottom right, becomes a major signifying piece of what the West African cultural identity and character looks like. As we move into the site scale, we're looking at the craft studios that become, I'll say cultural identity one more time, but become a large piece of what it means to be West African. What it means to be West African, particularly in that level of the detail and the materiality and the craft making, really becomes a large piece of, a large kind of antenna of this thesis exploration. So as you can see in the previous slide, you're seeing it on the boards as well, where these craft studios become a part of the site context as a whole and really activates that area. You see some images here of the craft studio complex in actuality. And then moving on as we move to closer into the site and further in at the Gele Heritage Museum. So I have not talked too much about the Gele, but the Gele, as I said before, the Gele is a head wrap that I'm taking as a piece of this formulaic approach of what the Gailey Museum is. So what you're seeing on the bottom right of that image and on the boards over there is you're seeing sections of the Gailey. And the characteristics that I'm pulling out from it is that idea of weaving and the idea of layering of space and the idea of recontextualizing in and of itself, in terms of these museums cannot sit in a decontextualized Eurocentric, cannot sit in a decontextualized Eurocentric approach. Moving into kind of what it means, what the repatriation process is characterized by in this museum. So looking at the ideas of the spaces, the kinds of spaces we'll need. In addition to the galleries, you're needing spaces that are distinctly West African and distinctly part of this approach rather than what the typical approach to a museum, typical Eurocentric approach to a museum is. And as part of that response to what a typical Eurocentric museum and response to what a post-colonial museum approach could be, it is one, as I mentioned before, it's one that is woven. It's one that is contextualized, one that is taking back these pieces of history and these pieces of identity back into their home places and really looking at what is the context for this? What is their home? So looking at the motif progression within that, you're looking at an idea of these spaces that are layered into each other, and it's not a single approach, and how that really applies itself into the museum plan and also the sections that you're seeing here, where you're really moving through layered space. Another distinct part of the West African gestalt and West African cultural identity is the idea of the motif. So as you're seeing kind of a typical fabric pattern in the image on the screen, where you're kind of pulling apart what these pieces, what these factors are in creating these fabrics and these kind of crafts that West Africa really is characterized by, and how this was interpolated and really abstracted into the skin of the museum, and how that is layered into that story. So here you're seeing how that, again, the skin is once again layered into the story of the exhibits itself, where you're seeing in this section and in plan, but also how it relates to the rest of the site, where you're seeing the plinth that is above grade. As I mentioned before, you're seeing the skin, but you're also seeing here in that detailed section, you're seeing how the spaces below the plinth spaces really becomes a part of that story and becomes something that has distinct spaces in and of itself on the plinth, but also in the layered space of the exhibits. All right. So going further into the exhibit spaces, you're seeing some images of the NOC artifacts, but also how the approach to even the gallery spaces in particular becomes one that's not particularly housed. And in that, I mean, the museum really sits at a point of the in-between, where these artifacts would ideally be repatriated to and then finally find its final destinations in their home places. As the site is in Lagos and not Benin City, or in Ife, where the NOC artifacts are originally from, you're getting kind of an in-between on house-spaced, but still contextualized. Moving further into getting closer to the end of this presentation, you're looking at a typical exhibit kind of pattern in the level 2 plan and level 1 plan, but you're seeing other kinds of space that a post-colonial West African museum would ideally have, where it becomes a story of craft and it becomes a story of market. It becomes a story of the day-to-day activities of the people and the day-to-day activities of making artifacts and making art in that space, but also characterized by the fluidity and the overlapping of space in the multifunctional exhibit space that you're seeing in this image. And that would typically house like possibly the opening of a new exhibit, or maybe some focused kind of talks in that space. Kind of ending the presentation on the marketplace and showing an image of the ideas of layered space in that diagram, and the same diagram you're seeing over there. You're seeing how these spaces kind of layer into each other and become a fluid but multiple stories. And with that, I will end the presentation on trying to give you an ending point on what it means to be a post-colonial museum and how we celebrate West African cultural identity. Thank you. So I started with a question of what a post-colonial museum approach would be. So from my research and from wonderful times with Michelle of Bracos, we're discovering a post-colonial museum approach is one that's distinctly the antithesis of the European museum, the Eurocentric museum. So I was looking at the museum approach of particularly the British Museum, versus what this museum would do. And in that, what I'm finding about the typical Eurocentric museum approach, it's one that's very isolated, and these artifacts are entirely decontextualized. You're placing objects in a space that is not suited for it, and is not really hinting at it in any way. But the post-colonial museum approach would be one that is both contextualized in its design in and of itself, but also is one that's not a single story, but is entirely woven and layered. Yes. Yes. Exactly. Thank you, Michelle.
Thank you. I love, first of all of your graphics, very thorough, all the sections and plans, and it's like too much to take in. And I think that the decontextualization is like effectively portrayed in the program, to have the way that people live, like the market together with the artifacts. The only thing I'm not completely convinced about is that like the inside renderings still look like art on a pedestal, which is very kind of like white cube, like you can see but you can't touch mentality. So can you talk about your thoughts on that, and how you see like the display of the art as decontextualized?
So actually directing you towards particularly this image and this one. So directing you towards that, the contextualized museum is not particularly one of the white box that you cannot touch. It is one that is kind of shaky, if that makes any sense. It's one that's not particularly, if you're looking at this image, the steps of the exhibit in of itself, the objects stand between them. And the objects this is not their permanent, it's not a permanent collection, and it's not meant to be. So what if I'm answering your question in any way, what is distinct about the way the objects are, in the way the objects are displaced, in that they're not meant to be there for a long time. Hopefully, they're not meant to be. It's not meant to be a permanent house. And so in the way they're displayed as on kind of a not level, shaky ground in that way. That in any way answers your question. That's a fantastic question, something that I missed mentioning. So the parts of the craft studios that really are in this area of the site are, they're kind of a little bit more removed from the exhibit story. But the exhibit story in itself, if you're looking at Plan A1, they are craft studios within the museum, but those craft studios become one of exhibit and craft, where people are able to like view into these spaces, but these spaces become a little bit in the middle, where they're particularly focusing on the repair of the artifacts as they move in through the space, and having the repatriation process be a part of that studio. Yeah.
Help us with the theoretical framework. What you're defining as a Eurocentric museum, and what you're saying is really, the alternative position you're playing here that's rooted in the culture of West Africa and of that place. If I can just jump in, because we've had so many conversations about this. I don't think there's a Eurocentric museum particularly, but I think what you've been objecting to is the extraction of artifacts from West Africa and integrating them into a European narrative of European history as sort of decontextualized objects in various ethnographic art museums, which tends to be very linear, right? So, yeah, I think that it's maybe not Eurocentric, but the way the artifacts have been extracted, right? Right? Because we talked a lot about extraction and reclaiming through this process.
Did you want to respond to that or say anything before I ask my question? So first of all, Layla, thank you so much. I'll tell you, I'm struck, as other people have said, about some of the graphics. That site plan, to me, compositionally, is just a very fantastic and wonderful composition, very rich. And I'm also struck particularly by the second perspective up there. And what helps me about both of those, it seems to me the struggle of your thesis, which is to find a way to design a museum that lies in between the dichotomy that Walter Benjamin set up so nicely, between a museum that has ritual value as the earliest forms of art, where they were impregnated into their place or positioned into their place, and it was because of their place that their meaning and their value was apparent to all who saw, and then the object, and then the exhibition value, which is what happens in contemporary, what you call Eurocentric museums, which have appropriated so many objects and decontextualized those, but also decontextualized all art and valued exhibition and tried to establish value through exhibition. And so what I really like about this, about your project, is you're trying to design somewhere in between that dichotomy. And the reason why I like that perspective so much is because the whole distinction between inside and outside for me becomes very challenged by that, right? Because as I'm walking down what you're showing here towards the entry, I'm actually inside before I get in. And I really appreciate that. And then as I go through the plans, which frankly are very, very complex and difficult to knit together, as you well know, there come points where I actually leave what could possibly be defined as a center, and I'm outside, even though I'm inside. And so that dance, to me, is the essential quality that you're trying to establish, and how that translates to the display of objects, I think, is also a challenge that maybe isn't as strong as this other more generalized global architectural spatial dance that you managed to perform. So anyway, that's how I understand your project, and I think you're demonstrating it in a powerful way.
Okay. In relationship to the previous project and your project, I'm very happy to see the university at least encouraging you guys to take on projects like this that have a special meaning to your culture and your background. And I would, right now, there's such discussions about artifacts from different cultures that Europeans and Americans have now in museums, but they're taking out of the context of a lot of the masks and the different objects from West Africa, from Egypt, from even some of the things from Greece, taken out of context because a lot of it had to do with religion. And I know about the Yoruba and the Igbo. And so I was really encouraged when I saw this, repatriation and how you're gonna come back and bring those things back home, if you will. And one of the things you said is that it's still a little bit like a European displays, in a sense, instead of how these things were used for those religious ceremonies or things that were components to buildings, doors. So they weren't really sculptures like the way Picasso and Matisse saw them and then made cubism from it. They saw them purely as sculpture. But I know some of the Benin bronzes and the things like that had a different position and use in their culture. So I think your next level, you've developed a really dynamic architecture. Now it comes to the actual exhibition design. That is a whole nother, beyond the scope of what they're grading you for here. So, but I would encourage you to now go and look at that because it's in the air that post-colonial countries are now reclaiming, their possessions. Some of the Europeans are saying, and Americans are saying, well, you don't have the facilities to do this. So it's great to see your generation saying, nope, we're going to go there and we're going to set this up. And, maybe it's a lot of the oil money from Nigeria that there's a tax if you can get it, and then to do something like this. So.
Adeola, this is an incredible display here, and I'll remind everybody, to be honest, I've seen this before. Adeola's with us, David, my partner's over there, but not presented like this, both graphically and verbally. And this is wonderful to see. I think clearly this is personal to you, but I think it's personal to lots of people around the world. I mean, you mentioned, the European issue with Turkey giving away the marbles to Elgin, and the idea that they wouldn't give it back because there was no secure place for them. Well, then they built the museum, and they have a place for them, and they still don't go back. They still don't go back. Right, right. But what's interesting to me is that these artifacts maybe to others don't seem as precious, but they are the most precious thing that you have. And I can get around the display. Yeah, I'll give that to you, of them. But, this is a really important discussion, and it's exciting. Done. Yes.
I think this is a beautiful project, and I think your thought that's gone into this is really extraordinary. If we are returning the objects to context, is there a context for the big object? That is, the big object to me seems overly informed by Western architecture and under-informed by what might be thought of as a critical regionalism. Is there a value to the vernacular architecture that might be brought back to this site in a clever way so that the building itself doesn't seem so much a descendant of the international style, and maybe is tempered by local traditions, local culture itself, so that there could be some edginess to the building that is other than simply the object that's foreign to its context? And that's just a question. We can't answer that one in the time left.
I was thinking the exact as Brian, and also asked the question, like, in a time where all the cultures and identity of the world are kind of threatened by the globalism of avocado toast, like, I hope that all of these art pieces don't only have a place in a museum, but are still alive in all the cultures where they're rooted.
To play the devil's advocate.
No, I'm the devil.
You're right. Okay.
No question about that. I am the devil.
So I would say that, well, I'll say a little bit more in my concluding comments, but your project is sort of addressing modern urban Nigeria, right? And I think that sometimes the vernacular, the tradition, is sort of projected onto other parts of the world by, in a romantic way by the West to sort of deny Africa, deny Latin America, Asia, modernity. But that National Museum proves is not a particularly distinguished piece of architecture, but it's an emblem. The theater, I'm sorry, the theater is an emblem of sort of male nationhood, 1960s. We're going to show them, right? And your address, your gelée, is that narrative deconstructed, right? So from the very beginning, I felt that this building was in dialogue with the National Theater, right? Why is it in the context of the city?
Yeah.
Why is it an object? So talk about your idea of an edge area,
But I'm
why
not
this is an edge
suggesting,
area.
let me be clear. I'm suggesting a critical regionalism in the tradition of the article critical regionalism. The idea is not about nostalgia. I'm not saying to go out and make ye olde that looks like it's made of mud bricks and stuff like that. I'm saying, are there traditions of vernacular building that can inform this without it being, without it looking like a kind of Lagos version of a Taco Bell, right? Which is really a horrible thing to have it look.
You don't think the Gele is
I don't,
legitimate?
that doesn't to me, this is a place where I have a place of departure with a building downtown. A headdress is a headdress and a building is a building. And I'm not so certain that I buy the headdress. And I think a building is a building, and I think there's a difference between the two. And send me to hell for that, but that's where I come from to begin with.
I think I'm on the same page with that. And then just to bring one more movie analogy is Wakanda, okay? When I saw mud hut skyscrapers, I thought, oh, that's not modern Africa, sorry. I mean, granted, that's filmmakers and then their projection of what it could be. So when I see pictures of contemporary West African, North African, and even my firm is now looking towards work in Dubai, so that's the 21st century. So I think you're in the right direction. I just think that bringing those articles back, how do you really make them true to what they were originally? They weren't things that people just went to look at and then go have coffee afterwards. So
Frampton suggests that there's a rub between modernity and tradition that takes place in this world of the critical regionalism. It's not like it's suddenly a rubber stamp modernism, and it's not a rubber stamp version of traditionalism either. So here we go.
So to continue, Brian, on your ideas, what I think would be interesting as the next stage for you as you continue to develop this in your mind, I'm sure thesis is not the end of this for you, is how to take those ideas from traditional buildings and apply them in a modern way. How you take ideas of traditional sustainability, of having buildings shade spaces, having tight corridors between buildings, how ventilation might happen, having, solar chimneys or whatever strategies were original to the area and apply them to the building. I think that might be, I don't know if you've thought about it already, but might be the next stage for development of this project.
Thank you. Really interesting building, really ambitious. And I want to push you on your narrative a little bit, because insofar as you're going to continue to develop this project, you need to develop the narrative, because I'm not quite sure it's there yet. And I actually think you're a little stuck at a kind of sticking point, which is defining your critical regionalism in direct contradistinction to Eurocentric Western practice, whatever that means. And really what you've uncovered in this discussion is that it's a hornet's nest. There's a deep discourse and a rub and something you could synthesize between museum design practice of the West and museum design practice that would be somehow in contradistinction to the West. There would have to be a synthesis. Your building already partly represents that kind of a synthesis. It absolutely borrows concepts from the international style. So it's incorrect to say that your design concept is in contradistinction to Western design practice. So that's where I think you need to, but I think it'll be quite rewarding to keep pushing and reading all the scholars that have been brought up today. Well, you've got Benjamin, you've got Frampton, you've got Hassan Fathi, you've got lots of good people to read to help you understand what a nuanced and difficult and complex subject it really is. And sometimes I think some of the really modern decolonial discourse gets into the same rut of actually wanting to block out certain ways of thinking because those ways of thinking are perceived as a sort of danger to getting the right answer, when really you can pull value out of something that's wrong in one way but maybe right in another way. So just wanted to share that as the narrative that I think needs more work.
Since we have a bibliography of things for you to think about, I'd also lay out that maybe another person that clearly influences you and why I think the discussion about critical regionalism can be challenged, hard, has to do with Foucault and his discussion of institutions and how they operate and how they try to create a sense of place and definitiveness that I think when you design a way station, which is what you're trying to do, someplace between these two poles becomes a real challenge.
Gotta watch out for that devil next to me. You know, he doesn't hide it fully. The red socks are there. So Lala, I want to commend you on creating a really spatially rich project. And, you know, we can put the other conversation aside for a second, but I wanted to just go back to that. The spatial complexity, that kind of coming back to the center, the ability to be at different levels in this space, the notion that you can come on a train and you move through this marketplace, and then you land on this island with this whirling dervish thing. I think that's really, really amazing and beautiful. And I wish your sections had a bit more of the light coming down it so I could understand a little bit more, like particularly a section on the top, because I think that center space would be really bright with light coming in, and it would help us read that richness, whereas your perspectives, you know, and I agree that second perspective is really great. The third one, I'd get rid of that big sign that's kind of in our way, right? I want to move it. I love the way you characterize the people in the space and the color. And at the same time, I also am so curious to think about what does it mean to make the argument not only that these objects belong to the place and the culture where they came from, but then the question of how do you put them back, right? Like, how do you put them back when many of them are also from traditions and rituals and cultures that no longer exist? How do you tell that story? Should some of them be in the water? Should some of them show up in the city somewhere? Should they be projected on doors that no longer have the thing there? Like, do we find them on the floor of the ground of the city? How do you put them back? And how is it also tied to language and, you know, people coming together and the other things of food? So I just kind of want to even think about that, you know, think about that whole incredible, beautiful challenge. And that's just something I'll be thinking about as I think about this project, because I don't think it's enough to take them back and put them in a museum like they were before, right? I think it's how it enriches the culture today in that conversation. And so I'd love to hear what you have to say about that.
Talk about that. I think you make a really fantastic point there. And I, especially like the first part of your comment was particular. I think the problem that we are at right now is that we've tried to answer that question. And I don't think that's a question for us to answer. I don't think that's a question for this museum to answer. I think it's a question for the next step after this museum. So part of the program is creating different levels of permanency in the exhibits. So as you move through the space, you're getting kind of an arrival piece, rehabilitation piece. But then as you move through the temporary exhibits into the permanent exhibit, which I hope none of these objects ever stay at, I feel like the answer, it goes beyond what happens after they leave the temporary exhibits. And I don't think there's a single answer to that. Yeah, Mhm. 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 Oh yeah, that'd be beautiful. Mhm. Right.
And progression out into the landscape. I mean, it's such a powerful form. It feels like this wants to spiral out to everything around it. And if you look at the building next to it, the Holland Slopes extends out and it's very symmetrical. I feel like we're seeing this powerful swirling form. All the spaces around it. Maybe the marketplace is a wing of this. Maybe it goes into the city and follows the street. But I feel like it needs more connection in the route or around it. So really focused, kind of spread out.
What I was really interested in this site in particular is that a lot of like the development in Lagos right now is focused in on this site. So they're adding they're revitalizing the light rail, but also adding more connections inward into the site. So I think it'll be easier seen maybe on one of these diagrams, but the Lagos development of this site is developing it into a major cultural center. So this land, as well as the land around it, they're getting majorly developed. So I think this is just a single piece of that story. Mhm. Right.
So congratulations on this great project. I really appreciated the design processes that you went through in order to come up with such a sophisticated building. Just wanting to go back to one of the aspects of the project that I don't feel like it received a lot of attention or discussion, which were the workshops. And I felt like you were starting to talk about the role that they could play within the larger concept of the museum, but then it somehow just died. But I think it also connects this idea of participation and making the museum a celebration of tradition and craft. I think that it can be exploited much further. And I also think that going back to the discussion of the museum, of the Western-centric museum, whatever, I think that could be one of the ways that you decolonize the museum. The thing about the museum is that yes, it is, these discussions about museums being repositories where art goes to die have been going on for a long time. So this isn't new. It goes back to maybe the 19th century at least, or even further back. And so, and we still have a lot of those museums. The model doesn't necessarily change. I think the most effective museums that try to integrate into a community are the ones that have a lot of programming for people to participate in the exhibition and the celebration of art and et cetera. But the way that you laid it out, I still feel like it's somewhat of a missed opportunity because of the physical distance from the main museum to the workshops, the way that they're lined in this linear fashion. And so I'm just wondering if you could maybe just say a couple of things about that. Why isn't it more integrated with the building? Why isn't there like a big extension of the museum, just sort of following that semicircular form? Why doesn't it just sort of continue out and become a big space for these celebrations and for craft making?
I think you picked up on it, that what I was trying to address, hit the nail on the head there. I think something I was really focusing in on is the procession to the museum. And so if you notice, Lagos is a huge metropolitan city, but it does focus in on driving to the site more than anything else, hence the development of the railway. But the way I imagine a person moving into the site is either coming by the rail, but I think typically, the typical approach may be driving my car, going to the National Theater first. And so being aware of that, and being aware that that's not gonna change in the next 20 years, 30 years, its dependence on the car. Being aware of that, I really wanted to focus in on what that procession would be like. And I think this goes back to both Professor Williams and Professor Kelly's point on what a non-Eurocentric, and I agree that might not have been the best word to phrase it as, what a non-Eurocentric museum and what a post-colonial museum for West Africa needs to be. I think it's not necessarily, my comment on that is that it's not necessarily a museum of West African buildings. It's a museum of craft. It's a museum of making. So allowing somebody to go through the craft studios and that becoming the arrival point of the site, I think that was a really strong sticking point for me to kind of filter people through the making process and filter people through the craft, and then arriving at the museum with that understanding of what I'm trying to do here, what this is trying to be. It's not the artifacts in isolation. It's not specifically, you're not going to the museum to see a specific artifact and then going home. You're really getting an entirety, a larger view of not any singular artifact. You're getting a larger view on the craft and the making and the identity of art in West Africa.
I wonder whether, since we know these objects that are there were actually not made as art, right? They were made as objects to be used in the culture in various ways, that the dichotomy of having a crafts area and then the museum, maybe that crafts area really is about making things that are functional, that become doors, become windows, that go back into the society again. And so that maybe there's something in between these two things that you're sort of setting it up for, like crafts in a touristy way, as opposed to, you know, the integration and celebration of the makers now, you know, doing stuff, which you may be doing, but we didn't talk about it.
Yeah, maybe you just need to get rid of the word museum, and it's a cultural center. Yeah. Yeah. Okay, here you go.
Sorry, I was actually, sorry, I just wanted to, I actually called it the Museum and Cultural Center based on, Michelle made that exact point a couple of weeks into the semester. But I think the understanding of craft here versus the understanding of craft in West Africa is very different, particularly in Nigeria. Craft becomes something that's, I think I was trying to touch on it in going through the steps of what I was taking from craft, this general idea of craft in West Africa. I think craft here and craft there means something entirely different, whereas craft is, it's not necessarily making simply visual objects. It's making objects that are, I'm going to say layered for the 5 millionth time. It's making objects that are layered in its function, but also in its style. I think just the process of making is so important to West African culture and West African identity. The process of making is part of what is being not viewed in a voyeuristic manner, but viewed in terms of this is what being West African is. This is how we got here. And I think just in response to one note about, I think Michael and Michelle both made a really strong point about the West Africa now and Nigeria now isn't what it used to be. So I don't think it would be quite true to its identity and where it is now if all the processes were the same kind of process that had been used in the past where these artifacts were made. Yeah, so I was trying to address that in, so sorry. I was trying to address that in the way, in some of these diagrams where I was taking the ideas behind that and the motifs behind all these pieces of West African identity. I was taking the ideas behind the layering of the gele and the kind of weaving of the pattern and the ideas of fabrics, and as I was showing the pattern making and the motif within that. And I think that's the piece that's really, that really stands out in terms of this gestalt of West African arts and culture and craft. Okay.
I know we need to wrap up, so I only want to spend about another 20 minutes talking about your project, but sort of inserting so much of the richness that you didn't have time to get into. So I would say that Lala's research and design process took two distinct but overlapping directions. One was the problem of repatriation and what it meant specifically within the Nigerian and West African context. The other had to do with site history. And that whole research layer sort of disappeared from your presentation, but we had a couple of good questions about why here, what are the conditions of the site, and you did address that in your written literature to a certain extent, but you basically are looking at that area not only because it's a focus of cultural development, but because it's a sort of in-between condition, right? Layers of colonial urbanism and then post-colonial urbanism. And this is an area where, you know, sort of I think overlapping waterways are exhibiting sort of sinking land and sea level rise. As your father, who's an architect in Lagos, gave you sort of an inside view onto this site, right? And the fact that major infrastructure dating from the colonial era sort of bisects the train and the highway. So, for example, one thing that Peter mentioned to me privately is there a train stop there? I mean, you're proposing. Yeah, so that didn't come out, right? You are trying to counter the arrival by car or the bypassing of that site by car by basically making an additional platform. And as I understood it, those studios were not only craft in the sense of traditional touristy crafts, but also conservation of artifacts that would be pulled out, right, and go through this preliminary process. So there's a lot here. I mean, huge layers, very, very rich research, which has been a pleasure to work with you on. And I think you have a very interesting project. I want to say that David, where's David? You know, David and you and I had really great conversations that ranged from post-colonial deconstructionist theory, you know, ranging from Foucault to Benjamin, to the politics and history of repatriation. I do very much value the comments that you had from Noni, Ranit, and others who basically said the next level, and we've talked about this, is how do you get these incredible overlapping, like unwrapped layers to both embrace the landscape and illustrate different perspectives on the artifacts and ways of integrating them into not single stories, but multiple stories. Maybe through performative means, maybe through lighting, maybe through changing compositions. And my final comment, I promise I'm ending here, there's sort of a shadow hanging over this project, who is David Adjaye, right? And his Edo Museum for West African Art, where he is intentionally addressing the fact that the Benin bronzes were taken from a palace, right? So I think he's sort of re-excavating or sort of making a relationship between the museum and an archaeological site.
The Edo Museum actually kind of sits in a very similar way to like the
Right.
Benin Palace, the Edo Museum.
Yeah. So anyway, congratulations.
We're going to take a 5-minute break while we spin the boards for our last presentation, which I think will be equally provocative and exciting.
Nice going, Ms. Lalala. Very happy.
I think we want to reassemble and get started for our final thesis defense of the day. I want to introduce our Master of Architecture candidate, Almas Hater, whose committee chair was Brittany Williams. And with that, Almas, I'm going to turn it over to you and let you carry us away.
Yes, carry you away. Thank you so much. Tess. Wow, this has been such a journey, and I'm so grateful to all of you being here, my committee, my cohort, my family, my community, my beloved wife somewhere in the crowd. Hey, shout out to Ebony and my brother, Asad, for joining all the way from California. I also thank all of you who contributed energetically and also physically to this community altar. I think of it as a way of grounding this presentation and bringing us all here together in this specific moment to talk about of land and spirit, reciprocity and ritual in land stewardship. I just want to begin by giving my thanks to all the little critters that came here. Just a little bit for the succulents. Do I still have to hold the mic for this? Okay. Thanks, friends. All right. Of land and spirit. What if every act of design honored our relationships with one another? If we understood the depth of our interconnectedness and strived with every act of creation to bring forth how much we see, value, and celebrate one another. It's a philosophy as old as time, old as this land and the earth. It's a mythology, a creation story, indigenous to many and a set of values shared by conservationists today. All species and elements are bound to one another, intertwined and sharing one journey. But we are in a crisis, one created by human design. The extinction rate of species has been steadily increasing, with no expectation to cease. This is cause and effect in action, and cause for alarm because our survival depends on one another. This thesis intervenes in this narrative by uplifting communal living and land stewardship. And I am blocking somewhere. Okay. This thesis intervenes in this narrative by uplifting communal living and land stewardship. It offers an alternative process and perspective for developing land in co-creation with non-human species and other humans, responding to what it means to rematriate the land. And it does so through a real partnership with the Black and Indigenous Land Collective based in the Appalachian Mountains of Tennessee and North Carolina. Almost all the residents and staff identify as queer and trans and/or non-binary, and I mention all this because it's important. For queer and trans BIPOC farmers and land stewards, investing in developing land collectively is a tool for reparations and shifting power, land, and resources. And for communities who have historically been displaced from lands they tie their ancestry to or denied claim to that ancestry, remembering and reclaiming their ties to the land is an act of freedom. This includes the traditional ways of stewarding the land and stories told about it. And their story is key, because that's what's going to change our world. The old stories of how we relate to one another, how civilizations and empires succeed, that are still prevalent in political and nationalistic dogma today, they don't serve us, but we can and are rewriting the story. And the role of an architect is critical in this process because, and I believe most of us would agree, we are storytellers. We weave a thread of design into structures that offer the possibilities for the present and the future. Taking on this role requires us architects to be more intentional about pre-design. Traditional phases of architecture follow the standard path outlined above. This thesis proposes a process that expands the ideas of pre-design that can ultimately lead us to a new set of outcomes that bring us together closer. It begins with connection,
that requires self-reflection and relationship building that will challenge your perceptions of the world, the way you relate to one another, and yourself. You change, you grow, you choose vulnerability. Through this, we rebuild our collective memory. We remember what it means to be connected to one another and our own bodies. This, in turn, changes the way we move through this world. You being here today is an act of remembrance, as is the collective altar and the attunement exercises and archival research for this land collective I will be sharing with you. In small or big ways, we will be transformed. I'm not the same designer I was at the start of this, and it's because of the trust built with the land collective. We shared our own connections to land, our visions for the future, and how we collectively and individually see the architectural manifestations. Reciprocity is the heart of this process. For yourself, for the people you're building relationships with, the land and non-human species. Therefore, in addition to the traditional architectural process, there is a gift, an archive. A set of documents, maps, and texts that offer identity and purpose for the community. It also feeds a new path of connection, remembrance, transformation, as it is shared with others and inspires them on their own journey in addition to the collective memory. The design flow I've introduced will be the basis of the next segment. As you'll come to understand, it really does begin with connection. For almost a decade prior to pursuing this degree, I was a community organizer. I was fed and fueled by conversations, stories, people sharing with me what changes they needed to thrive. I spent my 20s doing this, and it got to a point where I did not want to think about the future my nibblings could have, but what my own future, my community, my wife, my sibling, my parents, I wanted to live in that future now. And I'm not alone. There is a beautiful community of queer and gender-expansive Black, Native, Indigenous, and people of color, BIPOC, who are reclaiming their relationship to land and stewarding towards a new possible future. A year into this program, in November 2020, I emailed around 20 individuals in this community. I offered the resource of a thesis, the time to think critically about a site and its design. That led to a number of conversations with collectives across the US and an invitation in May 2021 to Western Massachusetts to support one collective's adaptive reuse of a home into multi-unit affordable housing. While interning for the design build firm that was putting about $30,000 of their own funds towards this project, I learned about the Larson Trust system, which is implemented in this thesis. I also got closer to one of the members who is connected to Green Holler, a Black and Indigenous-led stewardship nestled in the Southern Appalachian Range of North Carolina. In January 2020, I was invited to connect with them and learn more about one another and our shared vision. About that time, I was just beginning my formal thesis process, which you'll see in the presentation boards and on the slide. I've started to add a second column to the right that is the thesis timeline for this institution. We were being asked at that point to find a site, make decisions about what should be built there, and start defining the program en masse. But in a reciprocity-based design process, you move slow. Over the past several months, I visited Green Holler twice and have spent in total only 8 days or 192 hours there. Much more could be said on that alone. We hiked across the lands they steward, shared meals, sang together, and shared rituals with one another. Together we spoke of this land, each of us are starting to go. Together we began to remember. So let's take a breath here on the steps of the main house. My views most mornings at Green Holler. I want to take you there where I recorded the soundscape, which my beloveds will be sharing in the audience due to technical difficulties. Well, sometimes you really have to strain to hear it, but I'll proceed. These are the Green Mountains of the Mississippians and the eastern band of Cherokee. This land was formed by a collision and then separation of land 500 to 300 million years ago, but the mountains remember. The Appalachians know their deep ridges share ecological history with North America, Europe, and West Africa. Its first roads were water-based, or ones that were carved by the elk that would become the base of present-day Appalachian Trail. Native cities dot the land in dark green in the memory of mound-building communities. and freedom colonies in bright green, where maroon communities as well as BIPOC majority cities in yellow. This is a country, a land with a legacy of BIPOC land stewards. This is an aerial photo of the Pisgah National Forest in the top left, part of the Appalachian Mountains nearest to this community, and a region that continues to be a superhighway diagrammed on the right with an arrow pointing towards where the site is located in this. It's a superhighway offering to plants 80,000 individual animal species that cross its path annually and 1.8 billion people oxygen. This land came to be in the stewardship of a community of Black and Indigenous land stewards in 2021 and has since hosted wilderness workshops to connect with the legacy of the Underground Railroad and countless retreats related to social justice movement work. The site spans 140 acres with several existing structures, including 5 barns and 2 residential structures. In plan, that looks like a hoop barn made out of plastic and steel where agricultural farming takes place, an unused barn right here. You proceed along the main road and then you go to the main entrance that takes you deeper into the site. This first barn right here is also unused. This is called the Gateway Barn. This is an unused barn again, the main house where we heard kinda the sound clip from, the workshop barn behind it, and then the cow barn beyond. This is another house that is for residential use already. It's called the Portal House that has a small pond next to it. And as you see in the key on the right-hand side, I've called out those shapes to give you a sense of the 4 different types of structures that we're going to be talking about. The Gateway Barn, Workshop Barn, emergent shelters that are placed throughout the site, and new housing. A site section parallel to the main road offers the experience of green haulers placed in the ecosystem of a hauler, which is colloquially defined as a length of sound of someone standing on one end hollering down to someone at the bottom, with the sounds reverberating off the curves of the ridges. As you can see on the site model that is on the altar, that's a site section taken every 200 feet. It's at scale from 1 inch equals 200 feet. Every 200 feet, we took a cut along the main, vertically, to give you a sense of the ecosystem and that hauler of all these hills rising up and converging. A hauler is also naturally home to a highly diverse range of non-human species. It's the ideal conditions for high microclimatic diversity, resulting in ecological phenomenon like thermal air tunnels used by over 64 high-priority avian species that migrate through this land. Attuning myself to this land meant not just site research, but also diving into archives and transcribing conversations, documenting moments of connection. The bottom right is an image of a cleansing ritual we put together in a small little cauldron of various different herbal and oil tinctures. And in this next slide on the left are hand models that I created during Summer Studio Anacostia Aviary that Professor Esbon leads, where I was able to focus on my site and think about the story of quartz and write a narrative text over here in the first person narrative of quartz mineral. And, oops. Thinking about what was their personality and what memories do they hold. And I think that it's the same pair of notes where I also talked about what it meant to taste the soil and what that tasted like, which was primarily very gritty and a little bit smoky. I was inspired to do this in particular because of my professors and their encouragement of unconventional subjects to study, precedents, and document a site. They pushed me to rethink what it means to see the sacred in the land and design, attune to it, and tell its story. You and all of my committee members have certainly transformed me, and in turn transformed this process and its designs. The Green Holler residents and I moved through so many conversations and questions as depicted in this design spiral, including what was needed to further attune to the land, identifying what needs to be repaired and how, and what it means to architecturally live in reciprocity and ritual with the land. And by overlaying the residents' movement, sites that are special, places they and I have visited in our dreams, shrines and rituals, we came through with this vision. emergence shelters embedded into the existing trail system as sites of reflection, structures in need of repair that could meet the residential needs and also model how to heal from the land some of the harmful practices of agricultural use from the previous stewards. And at the base of the first ridge, colloquially known as the bottom of the top, they shared their vision for new housing, for living in reciprocity and ritual. For each of those categories, we began to codify a set of design values or guidelines. The column headings are each of their values with an architectural interpretation named below in a lighter color and illustrated in hand drawings. First, disrupt paradigms and circulate with nature. As queer and trans, non-binary, BIPOC, there's so much societal programming to heal from. Disrupting paradigms is much needed, and moving with nature is identified as the key. In emergent structures, this is realized as an unconditioned space you can move through in the trail system. In repairing structures, a new component can be added that offers balance to the existing conditioned space. And in the new housing, moving through nature to enter conditioned masses on a daily basis can help you shed what does not serve you. Through apertures, this connection to nature can be built upon by creating an opening in emergent shelters in the land, carving one into existing structures as we repair them, or building them anew. And as we literally and figuratively see more of the land, we understand how we can address the harm it has experienced. This land for 2 stewards, at least before Green Holler, was used for agricultural purposes, and damage can be seen across the site because of tractors carving paths into ridges that leave the soil exposed, eroding, and creating possibly risky futures. Emergent structures and the repair of the barns require addressing this, as well as in one barn's case, reducing its square footage to mitigate its impact. And for the new housing, there's potential to plant new trees in areas where they were previously cut down for farming. All new structures utilize helical piles to let them have a lighter touch on the land. And ritual is embedded into the design through handcraft, which I appreciate Lala going before me and talking a little bit more about why handcraft can mean so many different things and have so much significance in the building process. The building of shelters, habitat boxes that are nested into repaired structures, and hand-rendered finishes of the different structures at Green Holler. Human touch and story is embedded into the structures, and in essence, the structures in turn become embodied. How this is applied on the site is the next and final segment, sharing the vision for Green Holler. As mentioned, the emergence shelters will be sited into the existing trail system. Some photos of that are on the slide deck right here. The precedents for this are unconditioned shelters found along the Appalachian Trail, as well as non-human species hides. They offer the lesson of unconditioned spaces that create the capacity for new ideas to emerge. The emergent shelter designed for this community is one that can be circulated through with abundant views to the exterior while offering unconditioned shelter below. It mitigates the erosion caused by the agricultural use of the land, introducing a wood grid frame with pockets for ports. Wood beams come together to form shelter and path, the symbology of an avian in flight. Its shadow is on the ground plane, wood lumber creating path and place for rest and reflection. The smaller plan is scaled on the boards to 1/8 of an inch, as are all the other plans. But I increased it, made it a 1/4 inch to just give you a more sense of the details on the boards. The diagrams on the side offer the roof view, apertures for connecting with nature, the north elevation figure ground, and the section. It all comes together to create an unconditioned aperture, a mouth framing the views of Green Holler. Next, repair. As mentioned in my timeline overview, the repair of the 2 barns uses a Larson truss system. Vertical studs stacked 24 inches apart, and the same row placed again 8 inches apart with plywood webbing between. As an agricultural barn, it is a skeleton of a building that requires a skin. The Larson Truss offers this, creating a new conditioned exterior wall while preserving the interior history and appreciation of existing structure by the residents. The conditions of the 2 barns are similar. This slide looks at the Gateway Barn. It's named as such because, as I mentioned in the overview, it is the first major structure encountered on the site. After passing this point, you enter into the residential area. A particular condition of the Gateway Barn is the eroded ridge that is pictured on the far right. This is a central ridge of the land that never completely meets the ground because of the tractor that abruptly disrupted that connection. This is where an intervention to mitigate harm done can take place and create a connection point with nature. The bottom right of the exploded axon over here shows the existing wall conditions, which is a framed 2x4 grid system sitting on CMU blocks, and this new wall that is the conditioned Larson truss that is being added to the exterior, preserving the interior. The furthest piece is the modular wood grid system introduced in the emergent shelter. And the use of the space is configured for cars to continue to circulate on the lower level through it to the other side, while also use it for a gathering space. And the second floor has been adapted into a 2-bedroom residential unit where previously it was bare. In plan, the existing conditions are in gray. They're quite light. It's the lightest piece of color on this slide, and then in bold white is that new Larson truss with the new apertures also bolded in the diagrams on the right, as well as the roof plan and the figure ground. The plan also begins to document the envisioned exterior connection to the ridge. It creates a unique bridge between the ridge and the building while also carving spaces for non-human species to inhabit. The workshop barn is located further inwards, behind the main house. It is envisioned to be a workspace for invited artists to have residencies and possibly create something for the land. The existing conditions mirror the gateway barn with the addition of a dilapidated structure attached to it, which is pictured on the far right, that which will be removed, reducing its square footage. A new structure is added, offering rest and reflection to balance the creation taking place in this structure. So in the bottom part of the axon, you see this usage called out of a creation space and a rest and reflection space. In plan, the new structure sits to the right. Diagrams on the right also offer the roof view, connections to nature, and the southern elevation. Moving between the two spaces requires moving through nature, inviting it into the guest creation and wellness practice. Last, living in reciprocity and ritual with the land through new housing. This will be sited at the bottom of the top, an area that was once dense with trees that were cut down for farming. It is inspired by Kengo Kuma's roof guest house that is sited in Kuroizawa, Japan, known for its vibrant avian habitat. There are visual connections to the emergent shelter's form, and the use is adapted to meet the Green Holler residents' design values. 3 conditioned masses are nested under a canopy, bridging them together. They sit on helical piles driven lightly into the land and selective glazing for views to the nature. The 3 spaces are curated for the use of reflecting, gathering, and creating, the 3 use zones that have emerged in this process unique to Green Holler's needs. And the exterior paths connecting the masses are visualized here, inviting the connection to non-human species surrounding the residents. This is a thesis in progress. In the time designated for this thesis, I began a deep friendship with this community. Some of them have come to stay with me when they're visiting DC, sharing voice notes and YouTube links for design inspiration. We were able to capture part of the story of this land and began to envision what new structures on the site could look like. This section perspective here shows the relationship between the structures and the land. To clarify, they do not literally sit right next to each other. This is an abstract look at all of the structures we've just discussed and their connection to the land. It also sits under a sky map of the day Green Holler reached its fundraising goals, showing what the constellation, solar, and lunar placements were at noon. It captures, I hope, the vision of what will come. And this archive, a DIY zine, is just one story of a queer, trans, non-binary, Black, Indigenous land stewardship that has a goal of healing our relationships to one another and the planet. Look at the archive. And I'm so moved to continue to dream and build with them and grow as a designer. Because as Arturo Escobar, anthropologist and author of Designs for the Pluriverse, says about the future of design, design is about creating cultural meanings and practices, about designing culture, experience, in particular ways of living. A reciprocity-based design process is just one version of changing the way we design, how we relate to ourselves, one another, in this gorgeous, beautiful world, that complicated world that we share. And in the spirit of this process, to close and to continue to build our connection with one another, I would like to end with an act of deep vulnerability with you. I had mentioned one of the ways Green Hollow residents and I connected with each other was through song. And I would like to share one with you that was taught to me by Rebecca Mwase, and I have been singing to myself so much in the past year. The lyrics are on the slide. It will be sung 3 times through. I will begin first, and if you feel called, I invite you to join in. I offer this song as a reminder, a touch point to this conversation, and a thank you for holding this space with me for the past 30 minutes, if not more. I so much would like to keep growing and transforming with you. Put your roots down, put your feet on the ground. You can hear what they say if you listen. Put your roots down, put your feet on the ground. You can hear what she says if you listen, 'cause the sound of the river as it moves across the stones is the same sound as the blood in your body as it moves across your bones. Are you listening? Are you listening? Put your roots down, put your feet on the ground. You can hear what she says if you listen. Put your roots down, put your feet on the ground. You can hear what she says if you listen, 'cause the sound of the river as it moves across the stones is the same sound as the blood in your body as it moves across your bones. Are you listening? Are you listening? Put your roots down, put your feet on the ground. You can hear what she says if you listen. Put your roots down, put your feet on the ground. You can hear what they say if you listen, 'cause the sound of the river as it moves across the stones is the same sound as the blood in your body as it moves across your bones. Are you listening? Are you listening? Are you listening? Thank you. I also have 2 committee members who are here virtually. I'm going to try to find them. But maybe I won't. Maybe someone else can do that and pull them up onto the screen while I answer questions from the audience. A tech person. Thanks, Lindsay. Thanks, Kenny. I don't know where I hid them. Thank you, Professor Eisenbach. Appreciate it. Yeah, I'm just gonna meander to the community altar since I'm a shorty and I have a stick there to point at things as I talk about them. Yes, sorry. So I guess I'd like to know a little bit more about what happens at this place when people actually live there, because it is intended to be lived in long term, right? So, and I know you talked about a little bit about the workshop barn and then the housing, but in terms of how people actually occupy the space long term, if you talk a little bit about that. Yes. So the question is, how do the current residents currently occupy this site, and also how they envision the future use of the site? So I will move back to, pardon me, as I navigate the technical world and the real world. So the current residential units on the house right now are the main house where I showed that view in the middle of the presentation, and the portal house on the right. Those are the only 2 residential structures. They're houses. And there's also a very intentional number of photos and which views that I have shared in this presentation. I've also not included any of their photos of us together as part of ensuring our collective agreements on privacy and ensuring their comfort in this process of being a part of an academic thing. But those are the 2 residential units, and then there's the 5 structures, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, that are the unused agricultural barns. And the current use of the site is probably more accurately depicted in this, where there are these opaque circles that show main activity currently taking place on the site. It's primarily around the gateway barn, around the main house. There's a lot of activity in the agricultural part of the site, but there's also a great deal of significance personally to the residents on the site that are in the filled in circles and the hollow circles, all the little dots basically, right? So they only occupy this main part right here, but there's a great deal of dreaming that takes place on other parts of the site. There's a number of people who just go take hikes and spend a couple nights up in the ridges as a way of connecting with the land that they're stewarding. It's 140 acres, that's a lot, and there are a lot of hills to get to know your own property in the middle of a very rural area. And their vision is that while this is currently just a residential community of 4 individuals, it will be grown in the future. This is, as I mentioned, they are very new, 2021. That was just a year ago that they met their fundraising goal, and they're still in the process of building relationships between the 4 individuals who currently live there. But the dream is to continue to build relationships, to invite more families. There is a continuing conversation of how many families exactly, but it will primarily be a residential space. It is a residential area. They're not looking to have curated programming like some other farms you might have heard of, like Soulfire Farm, Earthseed in Durham. They have more community workshops, and they're very much renting to them to have a space to host retreats and other gatherings. That's not the vision of this site. It is to live in the land and just be with the land. Julie? Yes.
Thank you for this. And I love singing. It's fun. I'm curious. It strikes me that part of what you set out to do, and I wanted to ask you this and not assume it, but was to test an idea about a design process that is kind of co-creative with a quote-unquote client. So how much of this that you've presented now, like the chart that you're standing right in front of, is really intriguing to me, and that spiral and these kind of photographic sort of collages of moments, because there's a sort of bodily experiential aspect of just being on the land and exploring what reciprocity even means between an individual and the land, and also between individuals in a community. So my question is, how much of all of this that we're seeing here, particularly on this board, existed before you started? In other words, did you have some of this in mind, or was it all part of the discovery of the thesis itself? And I love the idea that it could be a model, but I don't know if that's something that you have in mind, or if it's something that has to be created from scratch each time.
Thank you for that question, Professor Gabrielli. I had an idea that I wanted to challenge what it means to design in relationship to other people and a client, and what a client-architect relationship could look like, and perhaps it shouldn't look the way it currently does. And I embarked on that partially because I do come from a community organizing background, which requires relationship building, talking, conversation, and it felt like not enough conversation was happening when we were talking about real world projects with clients, and just the whole idea of a pre-design process being something that maybe is only a few months, and then you go into the deep design of a structure. So I wanted to spend as much time possible. As my professors know, I've always lived in the pre-design process in all my studio work. It's been really important for me, and I wanted the thesis to focus on that. But in terms of what the process actually looks like and the bubbles and the text of describing each of those bubbles, Britt can tell you it has changed so many times and has developed and redeveloped based off of more clarity from reflection and time processing this whole entire thesis. And yes, this is a very particular process, in particular the design values that came out of relationship building. I would posit that while the process in my personal version of reciprocity-based design will stay the same, the design values and the timeline, the remembrance transformation will all look different based off of what the needs are of the community. And as this box kind of suggests of the future of this work, this is only grown in its scale. We now have an urban planner who is joining in the conversation. We have other artists and designers who are engaging with this collective and us engaging with one another to help support each other in rethinking what it means to designing the built environment and how can we support queer and trans, non-binary, BIPOC folks in the lands that they're stewarding.
Thank you. What I think is most exciting about this thesis is that you're changing the role of the architect, or that's making the change, is that the architect is an entrepreneurial and creating your own project for how you want to live. And I think that that's what architecture is all about. It's all about people and solving problems to meet our needs for how we want to live today. And I think that, I really appreciate the connection to nature, and I especially like the emergent shelters, like in nature, because I feel like that is what you're talking about. This flexibility and not necessarily living in like a conventional building that's just planted in nature, which is what we see all the time in the classic vacation house, where you'll go to like the beach and you'll just find any suburban house along the water, and you really are disconnected from the landscape and everything. So here, I think that, with the three buildings that interact with one another at different levels, that it's getting that across. The Gateway Barn, for some reason, I feel like is a more conventional interpretation, and the top floor kind of reminds me of like a townhouse or an urban apartment, something you would find in an apartment building. And I'm particularly disturbed by the car inside the building because it reminds me of the suburbs and everything that I don't like. But I'm just very interested to see when you spend more time in nature, because you said that you've only been there 8 days, how your design thinking evolves and changes. So thank you.
Thank you so much for that comment. Two things that came up while you were speaking were, yeah, I mean, as you know, as architects, there are decisions that maybe we wouldn't make, but our clients very much want to maintain. And this is definitely the use of a car on the lower level. It is something that is used by all of the residents, and kind of like it's going to stay that way. And I didn't want to just pretend that it wasn't going to. As well as some of the more conventional layouts on the second floor. And the way I personally reconciled it was that as this is the Gateway Barn, it's that first introduction to this community, and it's kind of like a tester, right? You get to be in relationship with this community and build more deeply, and then you get invited further into the land, which perhaps that's when you get to interact with the emergent shelters, the new housing, and start shifting what you think spatially should exist here for the residents. So that's a little bit of that, and I already forgot my second comment. But I know there was another question here. Maybe I'll remember it.
Thank you, Almas, for your presentation. It was great. It's fantastic, and I love the project and the scope and the philosophy behind it. One thing that I was intrigued about, and maybe you talked about this and maybe just flew over my head, I didn't catch it, but it seems like there's a lot of attention and work on dedicated to some of the construction elements and materials, and I'm sort of intrigued by some of the elements that you're presenting and the, I don't know anything about, you know, what a Larson truss is, or what is it, SIP? No, helical piles. And I'm also wondering if the materials, the sourcing of them, and the techniques, the construction techniques are somehow tied in with the whole sort of philosophical framework, that is spiritual philosophical framework that you're setting up. And if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, thank you. So kind of connects, I think, to what I forgot to say in our comment, was that some of these are in, like, this is all in process of development on the site. The new housing will continue to be reiterated, and while they are currently fundraising for the renovations of the 2 barns, and as well as the emergent shelters on the land. And some of the thoughts of locally sourced materials is there are a number of trees that are currently on the site. I mean, a number is to say the least, right? And we've already discussed using tulip poplar for the emergent structures, and it's just a process of slowly tuning into what the residents say they want to use as a material. They felt very called to tulip poplar. It's one of the most prevalent trees around the main house, located right here, which has that circle of main activity around it, and it's a tree that always like waves its leaves at them, so they just felt like it would be really sweet to use that tree as part of developing this. And there are a number of workshops that we've discussed taking. The residents are currently taking a workshop on how to build cob houses. That's something that they're very interested in. And we continue, as I mentioned, to share YouTube links and voice notes with one another of the different materials that really inspire them, and just collectively building a palette that when it is time to build, we know that there is like this whole rich set of decisions that have already been made. Sorry, let me hear.
And I'm just reeling a question from Jen. And Jen is asking, are there any particular memories or instances that moved your work while you were in the community?
Thank you, Jennifer. There are a number of people who are also joining virtually from Facebook and YouTube, and Mahira is relaying questions. You might hear Mahira ask a couple questions. Jen asked particular moments that were inspirational, that were moving. Yeah, I really wanted to include this ritual that we did together as an offering of vulnerability with you all, that we just had a moment when we were sitting on the patio of the main house, and we're just feeling really called and pulled to do a collective movement together, which is really what a ritual is, right? It's we're all identifying a process that we want to go through together and be transformed on the other side of it. And we put different ingredients together that kind of help us to get to that point of being changed in some way on the other side of it. And so we put together a little pot with rosemary. I actually have a bundle that they gifted me that's sitting on the collective altar right here, and a number of other different accoutrements that went in, and we burned it and walked around the house and just talked with each other about what that process feels like in our body to put together something and burn it as an offering to the space that we're holding together. In the same way that some of you who have participated, either just putting something on this altar or looking at it even, or engaging with it, I hope has offered some sort of feeling inside your body, right? That has brought you closer to yourself and how you might feel about anything that I'm talking about. Some other things that I wanted to share are just on this altar, I've picked up a number of quartz and jasper that I picked up along the site, as well as a piece of wood. I brought back dirt and soil from the land as well. And this is soil that has been offered by Professor Gabrielli and my sibling from the building outside. And just, acts like that really move me and help me maintain this connection, this antenna with the land while I'm here in DC thinking about designs and dreaming about and scheming about the next time I can go visit them.
This is just to kind of piggyback on what Juan was discussing, which was, getting a little bit deeper into the materiality, which is such a, wonderful thing that you've brought to us today. I'm sensing from the altar and from some of your earlier design explorations, the conversation about quartz. And looking at the shelters that you've designed, I love that, you're thinking carefully about wood as a reflection of this forest that you're designing in. Love the comment about tulip poplar. But when it comes to the foundations, I'm wondering, it's really interesting in these settings where you have the valleys that have kind of like deep sediment, this almost like clay, right, soil. But then as you move up the mountain, the bedrock is actually sometimes really close to the surface. And it's almost like the rock is asking to be used as the foundation. And it can be fairly non-invasive and sort of intuitive to use that rock as the foundation, maybe as opposed to kind of like building up the piles. And it's a really different experience of feet on the ground or touching down. So that could be an interesting thing to think about, in the iterations of the shelters. And I think it's very much present already in the presentation. The other thing that strikes me about, I'm so glad that you brought some of the materials in the altar, is that this clay, or this soil seems like a clayey soil, which is an amazing construction material, and you've talked about cob. But also, there may be a way to connect some of these burning rituals to the production of material. So if you burn the clay soil, you create this perfect ingredient for a kind of natural concrete. Anyway, so I think there's some really interesting potential material explorations here that could continue to unfold.
Wow, that's amazing. I love it. And I think Shalini is taking notes. So we'll definitely be discussing those materials. Yes, oh. Thanks for coming.
I'm interested to know, earlier in the presentation, you talked about the process being slow and how you had to move slowly in it, in this collaboration with community. I understand what I think I understand about architecture school, right? Is that they're teaching you all of these practices and processes for becoming a practicing architect. What are, or were there practices that you had to develop in order to move slowly in this particular context that may have challenged or been counter to the training that you had as an architect and the way that the traditional architectural process works with a client?
Thank you. So the question is around what I have been taught so far, thus in my design education, and things that I might have had to unlearn in the process to be designing in the ways that I have described. I think foremost, I have had to unlearn that I can't be here as a queer, non-binary person and South Asian person and talk about the things that I have done as ritual, as ceremony, think my own personal ideas around reciprocity, and really appreciating Britt so much. It would not have been possible without having a queer mentor like you, and just so much love for being able to see me and encourage me. And I think that's been foremost the biggest curve is representation in this field, in this institution, and our classes and the conversations that we're having. I also have so much gratitude to Professor Lamprakos, Yana, Michael, Julie, Ronit. You know, all of you have had so many conversations with me and really encouraged me to just pursue whatever I'm interested in, regardless of the fact that the ways that I talk about it perhaps are not as familiar in our field yet, or in the particular ways that I'm learning about our field. I think the other thing that I touched upon very early was just like the pre-design process is, at least as I've been taught, very short and brief. I'm sure in the real world there are firms, like I imagine the y'all's firm, Esban Vandergroot, or Vandergroot Esban, have y'all talk about a research-based practice. I imagine there are firms like that that are pursuing this thought process in their own way. And as I said, I think there are so many ways, as Arturo Escobar says, there are so many ways to design, and we need all those different ways of design thinking to emerge and be utilized right now to reimagine the way that we design our built environment, and in turn, how the built environment informs our societal values.
Thank you so much for this excellent presentation and project. I was wondering from a process perspective, if there are lessons learned that you reflected on, and also curious about what most challenged and surprised you, if you're willing to share.
I think a deep regret is that I threw away a lot of my trace, and the hand model that was documented there, I just was like, there's just so much stuff, and kind of wish I had it to be able to show you more of what the process was like. But I imagine you all know what it's like to have a room full of trace and you just kind of want to start over again. That I learned so much about and was very challenged by visuals, and it's a skill that I never had coming into this program. I do not have a background in design or architecture. I did history and government. You know, I just wanted to know more about stuff. So I had to completely learn how to use Adobe, Revit, all these things. And I'm really grateful for the mentorship from my committee members who have really encouraged me and pushed me to develop a style that resonates with people when they see it. And I know that there are improvements that will continue to be made as I grow as a visual designer. Yeah, Pabrita.
So I know nothing about architect, but I would love to, but I do know about a lot about organizing. I'd be curious to hear an example of from the connectivity to the remembrance to the transformation in regards to one of the structures. I'm especially interested in the structure where it goes from below to above and connecting through nature, and wondering where that may connect to some of the pieces of remembrance. Just a tangible example. And if one of them was that you had a thought process of your own that really transformed in the journey to actually result in one of the structural needs. Here's a microphone. Yeah, that one right there. But any of them would be great. I'd love to hear that transformation process for you in community and what that resulted in structure.
That's a great question. I'm gonna pause. You know, that was such a tough structure because we started off just talking about the workshop barn itself and how it could turn into kind of like a studio space. There would be just one structure, and the back of it would become a bedroom that maybe it's like a Murphy bed that folds into the wall and then pops out when you're not working. And then it turned into a place where there's, why don't we utilize the space that's around it and build a new structure? And then what does the path between that look like? And it was like this really like kooky little design that was an arc that was going around the whole entire perimeter on the back side of it. And that just didn't resonate in the same way that I thought it might with my committee members and also the residents. And we ultimately transformed it into the current path iteration that it is now. It's a path that has some cuts in it for the trees, for the courts to push through and make itself known. And that wasn't the initial thought about the design. It would be, and also that we would be covering up all of the interiors and maybe it would just be like a conventional design, right? Like I think I gave them a few different rendering options that I, in retrospect, could have shared, but they were very like conventional, like minimalist, white interiors, black features, or like appliances or whatnot, you know? And it was just like, this is not it, you know? So it became more of like, okay, like this is what I was taught, but maybe like I'll go with what I know. And how about we start exposing the structure because we all love it? How about we think about handcraft, which we didn't talk so much about, but what are ways that we can start using artists who are coming in here for residencies to create unique shingles or other wall finishes that can be applied and be part of the story of telling who has come to this land and what they have left behind and offered in reciprocity. Yeah, I kind of don't know who I'm supposed to go to.
Thank you. I want to thank you for this presentation. I confess I was a little, this is a little bit out of my comfort zone. In the sense that being a practitioner in civic architecture and other types of, we do have a process, and I can see that your process is actually something that you are actually exploring, and your thesis is really about this process and its relationship with this community and with the land, and made me think about things like really celebrated architects like Frank Lloyd Wright and their programs like Taliesin West and where the learning of architecture had a component of being one with the land and working with it. Also, Alvar Aalto and Scandinavian architecture, and the connection of that process, and the connection of the design with the land, the design with the materials, and the tectonics of it, how you would actually have beams in wood and how they would connect with each other, all these things that are wonderful. So when I'm looking at this thesis, I am looking for that connection where you make that you close that gap with architecture. And you actually are saying, okay, this is a clay soil. This is how I'm actually using it. How am I connecting this building to the earth? Or the building, how is this roof actually building? Let me show you a section. So I commend you for this wonderful research, and I love it. I want to be in this space. But I miss seeing a little bit of that more rigorous study, and maybe you've done that, and it's not quite showing right now here. But this is something that I hope that as you go forward, becoming a licensed architect, you understand that process. Our profession is a collaborative profession. We do need to be in connection with our community, with our clients, and learn from them. So, but I enjoyed the way that you went about it, and I just want to say thank you for that. Thanks. It was a comment, not a question.
Thank you so much. And I pursued a little bit of that rigor in the section details that I didn't go into in my presentation. They do start to think about like, what does it mean to hit the ground? What does it look like between studs that I mentioned, Larson Truss, like what exactly are those materials, the spacing and whatnot. So there is a touch of that in select section details, which I'm looking forward to further refining and developing in the future. Thank you.
Almas, really wonderful. you wrote a fabulous paper in my general history of architecture course, and I think you're one of the only students who's written a paper about the oldest architecture, Neolithic architecture and things like that, and also comparing it across various global societies. And I think a huge part of your method and process is trying to find the right solution in age, in a connection with things that have long durability. And the things that survive from 10,000 BCE are the things that were meant to survive. They were, and the things that weren't as important to build out of durable materials have not survived. And there's something to that. At the same time, one of the things that you said was you really like to expose structure a couple of comments ago. And in art historical discourse, there's a kind of a it's kind of a dichotomy between symbolism and structure that I wonder if you're bringing back together, that really structure is united with the most primordial solutions for dwelling and the most potent symbolism. Am I making any sense, and can you comment on that?
You're absolutely making sense. It was actually one of the columns in a previous iteration of the design values where I talked about exposed structure as being like this visual symbolism for connecting to your roots and knowing your roots and knowing your skeleton. And then I was like, that's pretty heady. Maybe I should just knock that one out. But that's great feedback to possibly include that in a future iteration. And I think I remember that presentation or paper because it was all about like Venusian architecture that is across 3 different civilizations. And I just wanted to say there's that shout out to the constellation map. It goes back to all the way the first semester or like second semester here. Yeah, I mean, queers love astrology. Some queers, not to make a stereotype.
Thank you, Almas. I wanted to just share an anecdote. You and I spent several weeks over the summer thinking about quartz and birds, right? And I was struck by your willingness, as you mentioned in your presentation, to write from the perspective of quartz. You were in the midst of so-called site analysis, and you were making some of the drawings I was asking you to make. And then you came back with the narrative that you have up on the wall there. And I just want to express that I think I was really witnessing your willingness to be vulnerable, to decenter yourself and take on alternative perspectives, perspective of the hawk, the perspective of quartz. And that writing and the handwork and the sculpting of quartz through clay, that was all a foundation ultimately for the work of your hides and your emergent structures and how you're trying to interpret quartz through wood. But I think a lot of the success in that exploration sprang from your willingness to be vulnerable. And I just want to testify to that it was wonderful to be witness to that, and I found it quite inspiring. So thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I'm so glad you're here because I feel like so much of the exercises that I learned were in your studio. Anacostia Aviary happens over the summer. Take it. Yeah, like it just really transformed the way I think about research and site design. And I think why personally for me, the emergent shelter is the strongest structure out of all the ones that I talked about because of how much time and vulnerability really that went into that. But yeah, thank you so much. And the other thing I just want to end on before I hand it over to Britt was going back to Professor Williams when you said that you were just remarking on how things continue to exist and survive. And I ended on that quote particularly around, design can be around creating cultural values and appreciation. That's a part, like this is all kind of like a sustainability practice in a way. I would make that argument that we are creating a cultural value specific to Green Holler that will create the longevity of these structures because there's so much value in them because of the design process that went into it, the stories that will continue to be told about it, and that is environmentally friendly in its own way. But thank you so much. I love you all. This was a wonderful process, and thank you, Britt.
Well, thank you to Almas for bringing us this thesis. What?
Do you think that you could just let them talk if they want to say anything for a second? No.
It's okay.
You get
He
2
shrugged.
seconds if you want to unmute. Exist out here with us.
If anyone on Zoom wants to chime in for a second.
It's cool.
Okay.
Yeah, sorry. Oh, sorry. You all have, I'm realizing what the time is. Oh my gosh.
All right.
Why are we doing this so long?
So thank you for bringing us this thesis. You have continually, every step of the way, pushed the bounds of what a thesis is, and I thank you for that. We need it. And I appreciate this process-based thesis and that you're so creative and incredibly thoughtful at every step of the way. And it's been really impressive and just personally very rewarding to work on this with you. And then I just want to thank you, I'm going to speak for all of us, for being such an incredible member of this community and pushing us to be more thoughtful and to think things through every step of the way, and for helping shape this program in the way that you have over the last 3.5 years. It's very much appreciated and very much needed, so thank you.
And thank you to everyone for witnessing our thesis reviews this year. And I invite you all back in May when we go through the process again. And with that, I think we're finished. Thanks to everyone, and particularly to the thesis students yesterday and today for providing such thoughtful and thought-provoking ideas for us to wrestle with. So thank you all for coming. If I could just remind the faculty to meet up in the Dean's Conference Room in 5 minutes, please.